your faces. It feels in some ways like a lifetime ago that we met in early March, and my co-chair Basil Segos will speak to what has transpired in the intervening months. But for my part, I'm very excited to see your faces and glad that despite the circumstances, we are able to convene in this format and again continue to advance the work that's so important that the council has ahead of us. We're going to begin by calling the roll for the purposes of the official record to understand which members of the council are in attendance today. And I'm going to ask Valerie Milanovic from NYSERDA to take this on in alphabetical order. So when Valerie calls your name, please unmute yourself and say here or present to acknowledge your presence at the meeting today.
Thank you, Alicia. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Good afternoon, council members and designees. I'll call the roll in alphabetical order for today's Climate Action Council meeting. And just a reminder again, you might need to remove yourself from mute. And with that, I acknowledge the participation of co-chair Alicia Barton, co-chair Segos,
yes, I'm here. Sorry.
That's okay. Commissioner Ball?
Yes, I'm here.
Rollis?
I'm here.
Oh. Hello. Commissioner Dominguez?
I'm here. Hello.
Hello. Gavin Donahue?
I'm here, thank you.
Hello. Dennis Elkenbeck? Circle back. CEO Falcone?
Thank you.
On behalf of Commissioner Gertler, Vince Ravachere? I know he was on earlier. Oh, there you are. Well, I can see you, but I can't hear you. So we'll straighten that out later. Rose Harvey. We'll circle back. Bob Howarth.
I'm here, thank you.
Peter Iwanowitz.
Yes, I'm here, thank you.
President Malatros.
Present.
CEO Quinones.
Present.
Commissioner Reardon.
She's here. I see her smiling and miming.
And I did see her earlier.
There, I'm here.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay. Ann Reynolds? I know she was on. You there?
Working.
I can hear you.
We've got you now, Ann.
We've got you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Chair Rhodes?
I'm here. Did that work?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Rosado? Oh, I'm sorry. On behalf of Commissioner Rosado, Keisha Santiago?
Good afternoon. I'm present.
Great. Thank you. Raya Salter?
Good afternoon. I am here.
Great. Paul Shepson?
I'm here.
Great. Commissioner Wisniewskis?
Here, thanks.
And Commissioner Zucker?
Hi, this is Adrienne Mazzone on behalf of Dr. Zucker.
Thank you very much. And I'll just circle back just in case. Dennis Elsenbeck, have you joined us?
Yes, I am, Dennis.
Great, thank you. Rose Harvey, have you been able to join us? I'm not hearing or seeing Rose. And did I miss anyone? Given that, council co-chairs, I noticed the presence of a quorum for today's Climate Action Council meeting.
Thank you, Valerie, and thanks to all the council members in advance for your patience and coordination with this format. I think we're making it work pretty well, but of course, you know, we are going to have to work together to make sure we can convene this conversation in the most productive and coordinated way possible under the circumstances with this format. I think we're off to a pretty good start, but if you run into any challenges, you know, there's the raise your hand function. And also I did want to acknowledge that Karen Fusco from NYSERDA is also available to serve as a point of contact for any issues. Her email is Karen.Fusco, Karen.Fusco @nyserda.ny.gov. Hopefully you had that in the meeting invitation as well, but Karen will be on standby in case we run into any issues. We've run through the procedures a little bit already, but I am going to just take one last quick run through without belaboring it. The first is, as instructions for the council members, please do try to stay on mute when you are not speaking. That will help us have smooth audio for the rest of the listeners. We will also be hopefully monitoring that remotely as well to help you with that if you need any assistance. And to, you know, we are looking forward to having a good discussion and to your questions and comments and participation. As was talked about a few minutes ago, there is the raise your hand function, which if you look at the center of your screen, yes, thank you for advancing the slide, and you see the little blue person with 3 lines and you click that, it will open the list of participants on the right-hand side of the screen. And at the bottom right, you'll see a little hand icon and you can raise your hand. I will be monitoring that in order to call on council members. Obviously, if you run into any trouble with that, let us know, or I'll also, you know, pause at certain points just to make sure we've caught any comments. Thanks in advance for everybody's, again, patience with that. We are going to do our best. I promise you I will do my best to acknowledge all raised hands, but we're going to be working together to make sure it's a smooth flowing conversation.
And this is just Rose Harvey. I've been here since the beginning. I guess I was muted and couldn't unmute, but they just did it for me. So I'm here.
Thank you, Rose. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for being here. Okay, for any vote of which we are going to turn shortly to a vote on the minutes, we will call the roll alphabetically as Valerie just did. So please stay tuned for that. And again, once again, you'll have to unmute yourselves in order to acknowledge your vote. So can we go to the next slide, please? Here is today's agenda. First, we will start with consideration of the minutes of the last meeting. Basil and I will then share a few thoughts and reflections as co-chairs of the council. We'll transition to a consultant presentation on work NYSERDA has commissioned, the emissions reductions pathways analysis. This analysis is intended to help lay a foundation for the council, the advisory panels and working groups on the work needed to make the recommendations for achieving emissions reductions targets required under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. We'll then move to a discussion on working groups and the scope of work for those working groups, which can provide some initial direction. And following that, we will also hear updates from DEC on work they are undertaking pursuant to the Climate Act as well. Next slide, please. Let's just start with the consideration of the minutes of the last meeting, please. The council members received the draft minutes with their meeting materials, and I will now pause to see if there's any discussion on the minutes.
I would make a motion, we approve them.
Thank you, Commissioner Ball. Do I have a second?
I think there's a question that somebody is raising. I'm seeing a hand there.
Oh, thanks. I see it now. Is that Peter?
Yeah.
Please.
Yes, it is. Thanks. Thanks, Commissioner. Yeah, I just had a question about the minutes. There doesn't seem to be too much in the minutes reflecting other items that were discussed by fellow council members. And I have a recollection that I know that Ann Reynolds raised a question about council members participating in sub-panels. It doesn't seem reflected in the minutes. And I know Gavin Donahue started the discussion. I hopped in on it in the question to see in future meetings a discussion item, which we both wrote to the co-chairs after the first meeting prior to this one. So I'm just wondering if there's going to be that section in these minutes going forward.
So it sounds like a comment about the needing to add some additional items to the minutes. I would be looking at the staff team who prepared the minutes to sort of describe the approach for this approval.
And I guess Alicia John Williams, I can do
John.
that. Hi. So we can certainly amend the minutes with the comments that Peter is making. We were trying to balance a little bit between having a manageable presentation on the issues that were discussed at the meeting without creating a series of minutes that was very, very highly detailed. But we can certainly make sure to capture any issues that any of the council members feel they ought to be captured in the meeting minutes.
In addition, I just want to note for the public's awareness, these meetings are recorded and posted to the website in their entirety as well, so that there is a full record available at all times. So I guess I'd ask perhaps Peter whether your suggestion is to postpone approval of the minutes until they are updated, which I don't think we will be able to do in real time at the meeting, or whether you would be comfortable approving the minutes and noting the approach going forward.
Yeah, that was my suggestion is, there are a couple of key discussion items that were missing. I'm not saying hold up the minutes now. They're fine. Actually, they're really nice. I think they captured a lot of the spirit of what people were saying. But I think in places where we do have key issues that are raised as discussions and requests for, future agenda items, they should be reflected going forward.
Thank you, Peter. And with that, I will note for the purposes of the minutes of this meeting, Peter's request to ensure that those requests for future agenda items are captured in the minutes going forward. Are there any other questions or comments on the minutes before I ask for a second to the motion? I'm scrolling the hands. I don't see any. One last call. Okay, so Commissioner Ball had made a motion. Do I have a second?
I second the motion.
Thank you, Commissioner Dominguez. And Valerie, will you take the roll to vote yay or nay on approval of the minutes?
Absolutely.
I showed you.
Co-Chair Barton?
Aye.
Co-Chair Sagos?
Aye.
Commissioner Ball?
Aye.
Donna D. Carolis?
Aye.
Commissioner Dominguez?
Aye.
Gavin Donahue?
Aye.
Dennis Elsenbeck?
Aye.
CEO Falcone?
I'm going to abstain only because I wasn't at the last meeting, although they do look reflective.
Thank you. Vince Ravachere? He may have been having some audio I'll move along and see and circle back. Rose Harvey,
Aye.
Bob Howard,
Aye.
Peter Iwanowitz,
Aye.
President Malatros,
Aye.
CEO Quinones,
Aye.
Commissioner Reardon,
Aye.
Ann Reynolds, Ann Reynolds.
Yeah, aye. Not working.
No, I can hear you now. Thank you, Ann. Chair
There's a
Rhodes.
delay.
Chair Rhodes,
Aye.
thank you. Keisha Santiago,
Aye.
Raya Salter, I'm sorry.
Aye.
Paul Shepson, Paul Shepson,
Aye.
perfect, thank you. Commissioner Wisniewski,
Aye.
Adrian Mizot,
Aye.
and circling back to Dennis Elsenbeck. I'm sorry, you, circling back to Vince Ravachere.
Aye.
Perfect. Co-chairs, I note that the ayes have it.
Okay, thank you, Val. And so with that administrative vote complete, the minutes are adopted and will be posted to the Climate Action Council's website. And thank you to the members for that approval. And with the administrative business behind us, if we could go to the next slide, please. I want to turn it over to Basil Segos, my co-chair and commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Basil.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. Hold that slide for 1 second. I think before we get going, I wanted to recognize Alicia. It's a bit of a bittersweet week for us all. Alicia is, as everyone knows, I'm sure, leaving state service at the end of this week. And it goes without saying that we're gonna miss you greatly. You've been a great colleague, friend. You've done enormous work at NYSERDA. One heck of a track record that you leave, massive shoes to fill. You've shown great love for your people and more importantly, really for the people of New York. And you've really done a great service for all of us. The governor was brilliant to pick you. You've done a great 3 years of work and you've helped to get us to this point here where we're now celebrating this massive accomplishment by rolling up our sleeves and doing this work. So we wish you the best of luck. I know today's a working day, but I just didn't want to start this meeting off without recognizing you and thanking you for everything that you've done.
Thank you, Basil. That means a great deal. Thank you.
Of course, and we welcome Doreen. We welcome Doreen Harris into the role of acting president CEO. So the next meeting, by the time we get together, she'll be in that chair and we'll be doing this work together. So welcome, Doreen. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off just talking about the last 4 months because it's somewhat relevant, I think, to where we are going. Needless to say, I mean, all of us on this call right now and everyone listening well beyond our council has experienced really an earth-shattering 4 months, unlike anything we've ever seen in certainly in our lifetimes and really ever in some respects. You know, starting with the COVID pandemic and the incredible economic fallout from that, which we are still dealing with, of course. And then in the midst of that, this turmoil connected to the killing of George Floyd and what that has done to our country to reveal divisions in the way we operate, the way we exist as a society. So we have not been immune in our agencies to this issue. These issues, we've all been heavily impacted by it, but I think as we go along further in the presentation, you'll see that our staff have nonetheless been extraordinarily busy behind the scenes, wearing many hats, but endeavoring to keep this entire process on track because it is so vital. Next slide, please. Just quickly on the coronavirus pandemic, the governor has said it. We've been through hell and back, and I think another way to say that is, we went from really the worst position in the country to one of the best positions. That said, we lost an incredible number of New Yorkers along the way. A lot of pain felt really across the state. We had people that even weren't even sick. We had people that were losing their jobs and going into unemployment. Seeing an incredible budget shortfall, stores shuttering, really an earth-shaking few weeks and months. Our efforts worked. Next slide, please. And if you just look at the numbers, and I know that many of you that follow the news and certainly follow the governor's remarks every day, seeing where we were, what we experienced along the way, and how we put into place a very aggressive government posture and dedicated real science and real resources to solving a problem and made very difficult decisions along the way. To have seen where we were to where we are now is really incredible. And I want to recognize, certainly Dr. Zucker's not on the phone today. Of course, the governor and his leadership, but Jim Alatras, who's on the phone, who was really one of the architects of this recovery, and Roberta Reardon, who's dealt with so much on the unemployment side, and really, every single agency in the state, every leader in the state. I'll just give you a brief example. I mean, we have 3,000 employees at DEC. At last check a couple of days ago, we had 950 DEC employees that were at work on COVID issues, and that's running testing sites or delivering supplies, and that permeates the entire government. Really incredible turnout of hard work and love for our fellow people that helped to get us to where we are today. We're certainly not out of the woods, but it has been an incredible 4 months, and I'm grateful for everything that you all have done. Next slide, please. So I think that's what's been made clear about COVID is, many things, of course, but one of the most alarming things, and perhaps something that we as a council need to consider, is the disproportionate way that the coronavirus impacted communities of color and low-income communities, not just here in New York, but really nationwide. We know from Harvard studies and other studies that air pollution, communities that deal with air pollution have a disproportionate share of the sicknesses and deaths. And there are, certainly we knew this for many years, but now we're seeing that some of the same lessons from COVID are applicable to the analysis of climate change, right? These same communities that deal with the worst air pollution are the most vulnerable to climate change, whether it's from air emissions or if it's from resiliency. So this is something as a council that I think should be earth-shattering for all of us. We need to take this, internalize it, and build it into our actions and our activities. Next slide, please. I'd mentioned earlier about the turmoil that we're experiencing as a country, and dealing with the reality of systemic racism. And this is really part and parcel to what we experienced with the coronavirus, what we're seeing with the coronavirus, and what we will see with air pollution, what we will see with climate change. And I would say that all of us have to ask ourselves if we're doing everything we can. Are we doing everything we can in our professional capacities? Are we doing everything we can as a council here to address the reality of systemic racism? Our charge as a body here very much centers on a positive outcome to that question. I have put that question to myself. I've put it to my entire staff that we need to rethink the way we operate as an agency. And that carries into the work that we intend to do here. So I think really what we need to do is listen, learn, and act. And really that begins today in earnest, but has been underway for a long time. And now it's really time for us to roll up our sleeves and take some actions. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to put what is I guess, an optimistic view on this. We have experienced these twin crises unlike anyone has ever experienced, in my view. And we were able to come out, at least from the coronavirus to this point, with a slightly positive story that we were able to embrace science and government and the right decisions, and people were able to agree with those, as difficult as they were. I think we learned that government matters, right? Investment in regulations, investment in the kinds of technologies that can reduce burdens in communities. These are the kinds of things that help in COVID, the kinds of things that will help us when it comes to air pollution mitigation, climate change. I put a question there on the second bullet: more public support for changing how we generate energy, and really how we generate all of our economic activities. I think, yes, there is more public support for this. But that last one is the important one. We can't operate, we can't function, we can't succeed without truly rising all boats. And that involves the environmental community, the environmental justice community, and those that are concerned with changing the way we look and feel as a country, to make sure we're all on the same page. So I just wanted to put those frames up front because I think it should guide us on how we operate, and it should certainly produce better results for us all in the long run. So I'll turn it back to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Commissioner, for framing this conversation in such a clear way. The work ahead is difficult, but these issues are so important. Thank you for spotlighting them. I also wanted to say thank you for your service during the crisis. I know you mentioned the leadership of many of our colleagues here on the council, but if any of you were not aware, Commissioner Sagos was on the ground from day one, spearheading the state's response, standing up mobile testing sites, leading the construction of field hospitals to care for COVID sick patients. You really, amongst the hundreds and thousands of others, public sector employees who mobilized, thank you for what you did during that crisis, and for your leadership to help bring the lessons of that crisis to our work at the Climate Action Council, just as you described so well. If we go to the next slide, please. I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about the state's clean energy work, what we've done through this crisis, and what we see ahead. This headline came out, in response to some of the work we did as a state. Again, I stood with a number of my fellow commissioners, Basil, Chair Rhodes, President and CEO Gil Quinones, as well as Tom Falcone from LIPA, to say that early on, even as we were in the midst of the economic shutdown that we knew was going to be a challenge for our industry, that the state was ready and prepared to engage, to lead on clean energy. And when I think about, where we were at the last Climate Action Council meeting in early March, we were talking quite a bit about, the opportunity New York has ahead to lead the nation and to lead the world with the promise of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, with the ambition of that law. And since that time, with this crisis that has overtaken and changed so many things, New York still has the opportunity to lead the nation and the world when it comes to devising the models for an economic recovery that puts clean energy at its center. Next slide, please. So just to recap, from the perspective of our industry and our work, where we've been over the last couple months, clean energy work was paused for almost 2 months out of necessity to protect public health during the most acute part of the crisis. We are getting back to work now, thankfully, across the state. Construction industry, for example, which covers a lot of the work that we're talking about here, was allowed to proceed in phase 1. And of course, every part of our state now has achieved at least phase 2 status, which is an incredible milestone, as Basil was just describing. Of course, we're doing that with safety first and foremost in mind, to ensure we continue to make progress as a state, that we support and build public confidence in our industry and our ability to get back to work. So NYSERDA and, again, our sister agencies across the environmental and energy portfolio, putting out guidance to clean energy businesses to make sure that they comply with the outstanding guidelines that have been promulgated by the New York State Department of Health, with guidance from Empire State Development and the like. We are making sure that we can create new models for how we do our work as an industry. We also, in that letter I referenced previously, teed up our willingness to be flexible and to work with the industry to meet industry needs as they've evolved as a result of the, again, the economic slowdown. So we have, for example, provided flexibility on deadlines. We have accelerated milestone payments in many of our programs at NYSERDA. We have supported low interest loans. We are doing what we can do to be flexible and to create an environment where our industry will be as durable as possible despite the economic contraction that we're seeing. Next slide, please. But the industry has been hit hard nonetheless. The numbers that we saw in March and April for job losses in the clean energy sector in New York were, they were devastating to me personally. They were worse than I feared. And, I, as someone who has spent her whole career trying to build this workforce, to build the clean energy industry, to see, the progress that we've made set back so substantially in just a couple months was really challenging. So far, we are seeing signs that may have been temporary in terms of the leveling off of the numbers that we saw for jobless claims in May. So the numbers that I'm showing here for everyone's awareness were based on the data produced by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then compiled by a third-party consultant who focused specifically on the clean energy sector. And again, March and April showed up really tough, and then May has leveled off quite a bit. We are going to be watching that closely as a state to make sure that trend continues, and to understand what the data can tell us about where those job losses are happening. It's of course uneven throughout the clean energy sector, but every single one of those lost jobs is again heartbreaking to me, and we are fully committed as a state to try to continue to do what we can to keep that industry on track, to support the workers in that industry, to provide, looking forward, all kinds of new opportunities to work in this industry. We've already been making record-breaking commitments to workforce training and clean energy in recent years, and there will be much work ahead to continue that build back strategy and ensure again that this industry will be resilient. Next slide, please. And I'm pleased to recap for the council that recently NYSERDA and DPS filed a white paper that I believe is a major milestone in implementing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And this type of milestone really sets our course for the state trajectory to 70% renewable electricity by 2030. As a reminder, the law requires the Public Service Commission to implement the clean energy targets that are included in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. That is a directive to the Public Service Commission in the law. That timeline is actually a couple of years out, but we did not want to waste any time. So we have advanced earlier than that with a framework that we believe will accomplish not only our ability to reduce emissions in the electricity sector, scale clean energy to meet that 70% by 2030 target, but also, again, create thousands of good paying jobs for New Yorkers and advance environmental justice for the communities and workers that have been historically neglected in these important conversations about energy policy planning. This builds on the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which passed as part of the state budget this year, which will accelerate siting and permitting for renewable energy projects. That is a major milestone. And again, this is all reinforcing to the idea that we can rebuild our economy with clean energy as a focus. The governor has been absolutely clear about this, and his leadership in advancing all of these targets and advancing the Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act and our commitment to following through on these issues, even in the midst of the COVID crisis, is really extraordinary and puts us again, I think, in a leadership position nationally to be able to create the models for what a clean energy economic recovery looks like. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight for the council an announcement that we just made yesterday that also builds on one of the key implementing steps we have taken under the CLCPA. So just by way of background for members of the public that may not know, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act created a new target for the achievement of distributed solar energy of 6,000 megawatts by 2025. That's a relatively near-term goal. And I'm pleased to report to the council and everyone that we are actually making very fast progress towards that goal. We feel very good about that, and actually have 4,000 megawatts between what's been constructed and what's pretty mature in the queue under our New York Sun program. But in order to advance the additional measures we need to undertake in order to achieve that 6,000 megawatts by 2025, we also filed a petition at the Public Service Commission, and the commission acted on that in May and approved new, really groundbreaking investments in affordable solar energy for disadvantaged communities and providing equitable access to solar energy. Yesterday, we announced that we were launching a particular program of more than $10 million in funding to address market barriers and to enable community-based organizations to advance local homegrown solar projects to benefit their communities. This is a part of the $200 million that was approved as part of the commission order, which is an extraordinary scale up of New York's investments in equitable access to solar energy. We're very excited about these programs. They build on programs we've run in the past that have been extremely successful. Again, individual grants are now available under that $10 million funding opportunity. And we really hope and expect to put equitable access and access for low income New Yorkers at the center of our solar growth strategy going forward. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand it back to my co-chair to make a few more remarks.
Thanks, Alicia. So again, how did we get to this point? We believe all acknowledge that the climate crisis is real and it's existential. And to truly address it, we need to ensure that leaders all the way down to communities and individuals are a part of the solution. I think it's impossible not to recognize just how we got to this point, and the really powerful community movement that gave birth to the CLCPA really encourage us to continue to help continue that momentum. I believe the movement will help us to undertake the big and bold actions that we know we are going to have to take, and the movement will help us to embrace and achieve real climate justice that involves righting the wrongs of the past. So it won't be easy, but again, going back to what I said earlier, and reason for optimism is that there's just more public support for what we're doing, and there's a real movement behind us. And it's important that we recognize that and stand with it. Next slide. Yesterday, in addition to what NYSERDA announced, we were also able to announce the appointment of the Climate Justice Working Group, which is a very exciting group of professionals. You'll see the names here on your screen. The law required us to appoint 3 people from New York City, 3 from upstate urban, and 3 from upstate rural. And then, of course, representatives from 4 agencies. It's an exciting group, a very experienced group that I know will be a great counsel for us, and will also help to provide insight into solutions that may not be as readily apparent at the outset here. Next slide. So, I mean, climate justice, as I said, really permeates the entire law. It's not just an aspiration. It's part and parcel to what we need to do as members in charting a path forward. The actual scoping plan must prioritize disadvantaged communities, and that means working with the Climate Justice Group and working with the soon-to-be named Environmental Justice Advisory Group and other bodies to develop and adopt that plan. In addition, the Climate Justice Working Group is going to help us on our own rulemakings here at DEC, both on co-pollutants and, very importantly, on defining disadvantaged community. What is a disadvantaged community? We will also be tracking our progress, not from a rhetorical sense, but actually from a data perspective. So that means putting in at least 4 monitoring stations around the state. We're going to work with the Climate Justice Working Group to design and place those stations around the state, because we want to track our progress, frankly, over time. So that will be something that we launch in the coming years. Next slide, please. So certainly the benefits, discussed a lot about the last time we met, the benefits of the work that we do. The law requires at least 35% of the benefits of our work be recognized and felt within disadvantaged communities. So that gets back to the important work of the Climate Justice Working Group and helping to define what is actually disadvantaged. Our goal is 40%, but 40% is a goal, and it's certainly not a ceiling. And I want to make that clear. We have what the law requires, what the law aspires us to. But I think, frankly, given where we are, and the reason I set up this meeting with a few comments about this sort of movement over the last few months, we should be aiming higher. And I believe the communities that most has suffered from the damage of air pollution over the years is certain that they want that outcome. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Climate Justice Working Group, and it has its defined scope. There's also the Permanent Environmental Justice Advisory Group, which will be named. We need to rely on both of these groups, and frankly, all of our advisory groups that we impanel need to work closely with both of these groups. This is not to say that the advisory groups won't have expertise within their bodies to embrace and understand environmental justice and climate justice, but we need that seamless relationship between these groups and the kind of work that's being done to develop the full scoping plan. Next slide, please. I'll turn that over to you, Alicia.
Yep, thank you, Basil. And I guess before we can really conclude the co-chair remarks, and we're going to move now to the next presentation on the agenda, I just I did want to, build on, thank you, your welcome at the beginning, Basil, to Doreen Harris, who will be the acting president and CEO of NYSERDA. So she will be joining you next time for this meeting as co-chair. And I don't think she needs a lot of introduction to many of the council members because many of you have worked with Doreen in the past, and she's certainly well known in New York State government. And I can also tell you without a hint of exaggeration, I think she's one of the best renewable energy leaders in the country. And she's been a key architect of the state strategy on large scale and offshore wind, large scale renewables and offshore wind. So we won't miss a beat with Doreen stepping into that role. And I look forward to introducing her to those of you that may not have met her already. She asked me just to pass on that she's very eager to work with the council and to continue momentum on this really important work. So with that, I am going to move us now to the emissions reduction pathways analysis discussion. And we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to introduce our presenters today from Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3, Snuller Price, who is a senior partner at E3, and Victoria Clark, who's a director at E3. And but before turning it over to Snu and Tori, I wanted to provide some context for the presentation we're about to receive. So this presentation and report of the evolution of analysis that NYSERDA has been engaged in really for some time, but that has also evolved significantly over time as we've seen changes in markets and changes in state policy. The work originally began actually back in support of the 2015 State Energy Plan, which included at the time an extraordinarily ambitious goal of 50% renewable energy by 2030, which of course now has been surpassed by the current requirements of the law. NYSERDA was then directed to complete a 100% renewable study, which over the course of the modeling and assumptions that went into that work, we saw significant change in renewable energy markets, dramatic revisions to the assumptions in the span of just a few years, all in the form of good news, which was that renewable energy prices, both in New York and around the country, have been falling dramatically. We were challenged to keep up with changing market conditions and updating assumptions with market information. Based on all of that, we've been revising the analysis and assumptions since then, where appropriate to make sure that it would be accurate and up to date and reflect what we are seeing in the markets, including here in New York, which is very cost-effective new renewable energy. We also saw change in state policy, of course, that dramatically shifted from where we were at the beginning of thinking through some of these analyses. And again, going from 50% renewable energy by 2030 to 100% clean electric grid by 2040. And so at each stage, we have been continuing to refine these assumptions. And I think, with that, you can think of this as, an evolution of ongoing work in that arena. I know there's been a lot of interest in this work, and so what we are planning to do is I'm planning to hand it over to E3 because it really is their work. This is a consultant analysis that's intended to serve as a starting point to inform the work of the council and the advisory panels in their deliberations. And in fact, it still does not account for some of the changes that are in flight, work that DEC will update us on later in the meeting, revisions to greenhouse gas accounting methodology. This is, again, a constant work in progress to really provide what I hope will be viewed as, kind of indicative and ultimately, helpful and informative inputs to the process. But it does not in any way bind the council either, nor could it. Ultimately, the Climate Action Council will recommend the strategies and pathways that are needed to achieve the emission reduction targets of the state through the scoping plan. But of course, we want that to be based on informed analysis and real-time data. So with that, I am going to hand over the presentation. I'll ask that you hold any questions until E3 concludes their presentation, but I do imagine we will have questions. So again, after we get through the presentation, I will go to those members of the council that raise their hand via the function and make sure we can get in the questions and comments and reactions from the council. Hi.
Just switching decks here.
Perfect. Yep, looks good.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Alicia, for the introduction, and it's really my pleasure as part of the consulting team to present to the council this work that we're doing. My name is Snula Price. I'm a senior partner at E3, and I'm going to just do a quick introduction and then pass it to Tori Clark to walk through. Hi, buddy. During this work over the last couple years, as we've been updating, we've really had the opportunity to delve deep into the available data for New York State and really been able to compile it into a set of tools that E3 has to evaluate deep decarbonization pathways. I guess a couple things to note about that. One is what we're going to present to you in terms of pathways are not a forecast of what's necessarily going to happen. The way we do these is we start with the goals as defined by the CLCPA, and then we work backwards. And that allows us to do sort of what if scenarios around, in each of the sectors of New York's energy and climate GHG emissions, so that we can look at what would happen if the penetration of electric vehicles were faster. What would it look like if we accelerated renewable penetration? And so by working backwards, we think we can provide good context for the achievements that policies need to make in order to hit the climate targets all along the way. You will notice in this presentation that really every sector is important in this. We're talking about reaching carbon neutrality by mid-century. So it's really all hands on deck type of situation. The other thing you'll notice is because we've got in our modeling framework all of the sectors, if one sector doesn't go as far on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that means a different sector will have to go farther. And so one of the things and the reasons we have different pathways, and there's many ways to get there, is that there's this balance across sectors, including all of the impacts that we can model in our tools, as well as a lot of the other considerations around equity that we heard about this morning and other things that we think will be really important to the council. I did want to say that we really see these pathways drawn from prior NYSERDA work as a starting point for this group. And, I think that in the 20 minutes or so that Tori and I have to introduce them, there'll be a lot of questions. And then following this, we're looking forward to working with the advisory panels in sectors to take even a deeper dive. So I think you should look at this presentation as an introduction, not as like we figured it all out and here you go. Not at all. It's really just to give everyone a presentation, what's possible with our toolkit to evaluate alternatives and what ifs, and we look forward to working with you. I did also want to mention that just echoing what Alicia said around some of the things that are evolving. So the results that we're showing here have not been completely updated for the CLCPA GHG accounting requirements. So that's something that we know we're going to be doing. And there may be other adjustments or this is a starting point. So we will be working with you all to answer questions about it. So John, if you go to the next slide. A little bit just background that I wanted to pick up on. What we're going to look at is really focused on New York State with New York's data and information. And as part of this process, we've really done a pretty deep dive into other literature in other states and done some benchmarking. One of the themes that you will see is really a focus on the electricity sector and looking at the 70% goal by 2030. Electricity and decarbonized electricity in particular, and the pathways that we are showing you are becoming the decarbonized energy supply for New York's economy. And we see this theme in a lot of the other states and jurisdictions that have taken a look at the pathways. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Tori Clark, who's a director at E3, to walk you through the details.
Great, thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Snoo. Go to the next slide. I'm going to start with some key takeaways, both from this analysis and the literature review that we've completed. And the first is that this analysis finds that deep decarbonization and carbon neutrality is feasible using largely existing technologies. We found that there's no single pathway to carbon neutrality, but any scenario that achieves this type of deep decarbonization shares significant progress across what we're calling 4 pillars of decarbonization. Those are energy efficiency and conservation, switching to low carbon fuels, including electricity, decarbonizing electricity supply, and negative emissions measures. So we find that there's some optionality around how much you lean on each of those pillars. Back to what Snoo said, you may decide to lean more on one pillar and less on another. So that optionality exists, but what we're envisioning is a really wide-scale transformation that's really unprecedented, requiring major investments in new infrastructure across all sectors of the economy. In passenger vehicles and households, we also see consumer decision-making playing a large role in the transition. Since consumers are the ones deciding what new cars to buy, what new appliances to buy, the exact pace and timing of that transition will really be driven by them. Next slide. Now I'm going to walk through some of the key transformations that we've assumed in the starting point analysis. To the first animation on the slide. As Stu mentioned, this is really a backcasting model. So we start with where we know we need to be in 2050 and then work backwards to make sure that we're on track to know when we need to start different key measures today in 5 years and so on. So in 2050, we're envisioning a future where we've achieved 100% zero emissions electricity. We've achieved widespread electrification in transportation and buildings, significant reductions in vehicle miles traveled per person. We see a large role for decarbonized fuels and bioenergy, and a role for storing carbon in New York's forests and soils. Next animation. And so what this means for today is that means we need to be increasing sales of high efficiency appliances and LEDs, and we need to start ramping up sales of new electric heat pump, space heaters, and water heater technologies, and sales of electric light duty vehicles. Next animation. In 2030, we're climbing the adoption curve of some of these new technologies, increasing the sales of more efficient alternatives in buildings. That also includes retrofits of buildings, efficient building shells and insulation, zero emission vehicles. We achieved 70% renewable electricity in 2030 and increased the role for advanced bioenergy within New York's economy. Next animation. And in 2040, we see virtually all cars being sold, cars and trucks being sold in the state, being a zero emission vehicle alternative, meaning that virtually no internal combustion engine vehicles would be sold after 2040 within the state. Next slide. So pausing for a second at 2030, because this milestone is about 10 years away, what we're envisioning is really a new normal, that in 10 years, Basically, more than half or more of consumers are opting to buy a zero emission vehicle or efficient electric alternative for home appliances when they go to buy a new car or a new appliance, which is quite different from where we are today. Next slide. So the modeling framework that we use to analyze these scenarios is called Pathways, which is a bottom-up user-defined model that allows us to build different scenarios of the future that ask what-if questions around different measures and actions that the state could take over the next 30 years. And this allows us to just compare different futures of what decarbonization could look like within the state, to develop different concrete roadmaps of how that could look. This includes all sectors of the economy for energy and emissions. So for buildings, industry, and transportation, we build this detailed bottom-up representation of energy, emissions, and infrastructure. So that means all of the vehicles in New York State, all of the buildings, all of the appliances. We're reflecting those and capturing the economic lifetimes of those technologies that helps us understand how long do cars last, when are new vehicles being sold, and what are the opportunities for new investments in cleaner alternatives. And this approach is called a stock rollover approach. And this bottom-up analysis we then validate using top-down estimates from the state, both actual energy use and forecasts, which gives us a really robust bottom-up and top-down benchmarked model. We also have detailed representation of the electric sector, which, as Stu mentioned, is a really crucial linchpin of this transformation. So we use a model that's able to do a least cost portfolio advancement, helping us understand what are the different ways the state can achieve zero emissions electricity while still meeting electricity demands from all of those sectors that we're analyzing in detail. And then together, this model builds an interactive framework that allows us to capture interactions between sectors. So we're able to capture the dynamics between energy efficiency, electrification, and decarbonized electricity, since those are intertwined in this future. Next slide. So we've built 3 scenarios that we'll share with you today. The first is a reference case that includes all policies and goals that were adopted before the CLCPA. So this is shown in the chart on the right in the black line. And as you can see, this includes significant ambition and emissions do drop, but there's still a gap between that scenario and the targets outlined under the CLCPA that are highlighted in those gray lines. Then we've developed these 2 starting point pathways that were designed around meeting the CLCPA goals, both the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and the electric sector provisions. The first, which is shown in red, is the high technology availability pathway. This one emphasizes energy efficiency and electrification at a natural replacement schedule. What we mean by that is at the end of life of devices. So when a car breaks down or a water heater breaks, we replace it and not before. That's supplemented with advanced bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and a high natural and working land sink. The second pathway is the limited non-energy pathway shown in green. This scenario envisions less contribution from natural and working lands and non-combustion sectors, and then compensates with more aggressive and accelerated electrification and ramp up of clean technologies. And that's coupled with earlier retirements of older, less efficient fossil vehicles and building equipment. But both of these cases meet the CLCPA targets by 2050, as well as the milestones along the way. And again, they're just starting points to help us understand the level of ambition that's needed to reach these goals. Next slide. Now I'm going to walk through some of the sectoral findings in more detail. As can be imagined, there's a lot more detail in this presentation than we'll be able to cover in the short time today. So I'm going to walk through the highlights. I'll also just mention that in addition to these slides that'll be available online, there'll also be additional supporting documentation, including a summary report, methodology appendix, and the literature review that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. And in addition to that, members of the E3 team will be available to engage with the advisory panels going forward and further down in the process to take feedback and answer questions on some of these detailed topics. Next slide. So I'll start with total greenhouse gas emissions by sector. This chart is showing historical emissions from 1990 through 2016, and then scenario results in 2030 and 2050 for those two starting point pathways that I described. And then top to bottom for these stacked bar charts, we're showing electricity in blue, non-combustion in brown, transportation in green, residential buildings in red, industrial energy in yellow, commercial buildings in blue, and then natural and working lands in the negative light blue section of the graph. You can see in 2030 that we have reductions across every sector just in the next 10 years. And by 2050, we've essentially eliminated all of the energy-related emissions within New York's economy. And what remains are the sectors that are really difficult to mitigate, largely our non-combustion sectors like waste. And then those remaining positive emissions are being offset by the land use sink in the negative light blue section, such that we arrive at a carbon neutral future in 2050. And then here's a point to just highlight that these CO2 calculations are based on the existing greenhouse gas inventory from NYSERDA, which doesn't fully align with the CLCPA accounting guidelines. So that's something on our to-do list. Next slide. Now I'll start with transportation. The transportation sector, when we're talking about it here, includes all sectors of transportation: passenger vehicles, trucks, buses, rail, marine, aviation. And I'll orient us first to this chart on the right, because I'm going to use it in a few slides. This chart is showing total final energy demand by fuel over time, and we'll just use the high technology availability pathway as the example as we're walking through this. The first thing you'll notice is that we have a really dramatic reduction in total energy consumed across the sector in this starting point pathway. And that's due to a couple factors. First, we assume that our gasoline vehicle fleet is becoming more efficient due to fuel economy standards. And what that means is that a gasoline vehicle purchased today gets better miles per gallon than a gasoline vehicle purchased 15 years ago. And that vehicle purchased 15 years ago will retire and be replaced with a more efficient vehicle. And when that happens fleet-wide, we see reductions in energy use per mile. The second factor is that we assume reductions in vehicle miles traveled per person. And those are due to measures like smart growth, transit, and other, like working from home, which is something that many of us have become familiar with over the past few months. And then finally, we see efficiency actually through electrification of vehicles. So electric vehicles are better at converting energy to miles. So there's an embedded efficiency benefit in switching from internal combustion engines to electric drivetrains. And you can see that electrification in the chart on the right, whereas in 2020, you can see that the predominant fuels are gasoline and other petroleum products. But by 2050, electricity has become half of all of the energy consumed in the transportation sector. And in addition to the rate of sales of new electric vehicles that I mentioned earlier, we also assume that the new electric vehicles that are sold are able to charge flexibly over the course of the day, which helps maintain system reliability. Finally, you'll also note that we ramp up the prominence of renewable fuels. And so there's a role for renewable fuels such as renewable.
We may have lost her.
Can folks still hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, great.
You cut out for 10 seconds or so.
Yeah, you might want to just go back to renewable fuels just to make sure.
Great, thanks for flagging that. Yeah, so the final point I was going to make on the slide is just that we also see an increased role for renewable fuels, such as renewable diesel and hydrogen, that can help us decarbonize some sectors like marine, off-road vehicles, and aviation. Next slide. In buildings, and here we're talking about both residential and commercial buildings, we see a similar decline in total energy consumed over the next 30 years. This is because we're pursuing really dramatic efficiency across all end uses, appliances, as well as building shells and insulation. We also have a major shift to end use electrification, largely in space heating and water heating. And this transition for space heating in particular, actually drives New York State as a whole to become a winter peaking electric system over the next 30 years. And the exact magnitude of this winter peak will vary based on the types of assumptions that are made about the technologies that are installed. Our approach has been to think about what a balanced transition would look like. That includes aggressive efficiency and building shell measures, flexible loads, and a balanced mix of technologies that could be installed to help mitigate that winter peak. So that can include ground source heat pumps and a role for systems with combustible fuel backup on site. Then similar to electric vehicles, we also assume that some amount of our building loads can be flexible to help with system reliability. Next slide. In the industrial sector, our main measures that we're pursuing are energy efficiency and low carbon fuels in the next 10 years. And then between 2030 and 2050, we see room for innovation to be able to pursue targeted electrification and carbon capture and storage for those processes and sectors where that's really appropriate. Next slide. So if we aggregate the impacts of the sectors that I've just talked about, we can see that total electricity demand increases over this time period due to all of that electrification. So by 2050, we see an increase in total electricity demand between 65 and 80% relative to where we are today. And the makeup of that electricity demand is changing as well. So in the charts below, they're showing total electric load by sector. And the big changes are coming from transportation, which is shown in that light yellow section. And the green section is showing electrolysis, which is hydrogen being produced through clean electricity. Next slide. So we're really teeing up a twofold challenge for the electric sector. The first is that we need to meet increasing electricity demands reliably. And second, we need to decarbonize to reach zero emissions electricity by 2040. This is going to require New York to tap into its significant renewable energy potential, as well as potential for zero carbon technology options and access to adjoining states and provinces. And so this really creates a large role for new renewables in the state. And the way that we've modeled this is to model a two-zone system. So we're modeling upstate New York and downstate New York. And then dispatching electricity to meet electricity demand in every hour in each of the scenarios and sectors that we've just described. So what we find is that upstate, we see significant investments in land-based wind and utility-scale solar. And downstate, significant investments in offshore wind and distributed solar, based on land availability and constraints. Next slide. To integrate all these new renewables that we're planning to build, we see a role for battery storage to be able to move power from when it's generated to when it's needed within the day. And so across the state, we see about 10 gigawatts of new battery storage being built in the state by 2050. We're also going to need new transmission investments to enable delivery of zero emission electricity from where it's generated to where it's being demanded, especially in load pockets in downstate New York. Next slide. In addition to highlighting the role of flexible loads and batteries that can help us move power within the day, we also see an additional challenge, especially in the winter, where we find that there's sometimes multiple days of low renewable energy output. And that requires a different solution. So the chart on the right is showing one of these winter periods. So this is a 3-week winter period that we're simulating in 2050, where wind and solar generation is shown in green and electricity demand is shown in blue. And what we're illustrating is a 7-day period in that black circled section where we have insufficient wind and solar generation to meet the demand. And so what we need to supplement is some amount of firm dispatchable capacity that's able to increase during those few hours of the year where wind, solar, batteries are insufficient. And so what we find is that a mix of different technologies can help provide that value to the system. And that could be bioenergy, synthetic fuels like hydrogen, hydroelectric power, carbon capture and storage, or nuclear power to be able to provide that benefit in addition to the renewables and batteries that we're also building. Next slide. We spent a lot of time talking about energy combustion sources, and that is the majority of emissions within the state. But non-combustion emissions also have an important role to play in decarbonizing New York's economy. These categories include things like landfills, farms, industrial facilities and refrigerants, and natural gas infrastructure. These are projected to increase over time without mitigation measures. So in order to bend the curve, we've modeled reductions across all of these categories. But the most impactful measures that we've included are methane mitigation and climate-friendly refrigerants. And I'll note that this is an area in particular that we think there's more room to refine our analysis, both in the detail that we have reflected of the existing emissions and the measures and policies that could help bend that curve down. So we look forward to working with the advisory panels, DEC and NYSERDA on this topic in particular. Next slide. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about negative emissions, which also have an important role to play here. We see a key role for being able to store carbon in New York's forests and soils, and have modeled a range across our two scenarios to illustrate some amount of uncertainty that exists over the next 30 years of the size of that natural sequestration sink. In addition to natural sequestration, we've modeled negative emissions technologies like biorefining with CCS and direct air capture of CO2 that can help provide additional negative emissions to offset remaining emissions within the economy to help New York reach carbon neutrality. Next slide. Now I'll move us along to some conclusions and next steps. Next slide. So the first conclusion is that this analysis finds that deep decarbonization is feasible using largely existing technologies, which lines up with the literature review that we've done of other studies in other jurisdictions. There are different pathways to this carbon neutral future within New York State. But any future that reaches carbon neutrality will require action across these four pillars of decarbonization: energy efficiency, switching to low carbon fuels, decarbonized electricity supply, and negative emissions. Consumers will have a key role to play in the timing of the transformation in passenger vehicles and household appliances in particular. So we assume that there can be a rapid adoption curve for new electric vehicles and more efficient household appliances. But consumers in the end are the ones that decide what new appliances to purchase and what new car to buy. So they'll have a lot of control over the pace of that transition. Next slide. Within the electricity sector, we find that flexibility across multiple dimensions is really key to maintaining reliability. So we see a role for short-term flexibility, and that can be solved using battery storage and flexible loads, both in transportation and buildings. And then we also see this longer duration storage challenge, where especially in the winter, we may have multiple days of low renewable output, but high electricity demands, especially from our new electric space heating that we're installing. And this can be solved using a mix of firm dispatchable resources, such as hydroelectric power, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and nuclear power. And finally, managed electrification can help mitigate the risk of very high winter peaks. So in addition to load flexibility, we see an important role for installing a balanced mix of electric heating systems, as well as continuing to invest in research and development to improve cold climate heat pump performance. And that can help manage unintended consequences of this electrification. Next slide. And then finally, some next steps. As we've mentioned, we know that adding the CLCPA greenhouse gas accounting viewpoint is one of the key next steps. So the two pieces that we'll need to update there are upstream emissions from imported fuels, as well as updating to a 20-year global warming potential. I'll note that currently we're aligned with the existing NYSERDA greenhouse gas inventory, which uses a 100-year global warming potential. And the biggest impact on results here will be related to methane emissions. And then we know there's some additional areas of interest and scenarios that we may want to run to fully understand some of the key issues in this transformation. And that can include the role of in-state transmission, the role and extent of carbon capture and storage, and the broader electricity generation mix, availability of in-state and regional renewable resources, for example, the role of managed versus unmanaged electrification, limits of electrification by technology and sector, within transportation, mobility demand and outlook for vehicle miles traveled. That's one that's been a hot topic for discussion as COVID has really changed how we travel and how much we drive. And finally, sustainable bioenergy availability and utilization within the economy. Those are all things that are on our plate to continue working on. Next slide. With that, I will thank you for your attention for a pretty dense presentation. It's been an honor to present to you today, and we look forward to continue engaging with this group over the coming months.
Thank you, Tori. I am going to go to questions from members of the Climate Action Council. As I was following along during the discussion, I believe I saw Paul Shepson, sorry, Paul, raise your hand first.
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks, Tori, for that presentation. Yes, dense, and so there's a whole lot of assumptions and information that is buried in there. Your presentation focused a great deal on technology and not much at all about economics. And I'm wondering if you can say a few words about assumptions that you made about things like policy tools, tax incentives, things used to incentivize both consumers and manufacturers. And I'm thinking in part about the assumption that we're going to go to 50% use of electric vehicles by, now I can't remember the date for sure, but thinking simultaneously about environmental justice issues, if that is to happen, and the sort of co-benefits can be realized for disadvantaged communities, electric vehicles have to be accessible. So you can't really run these scenarios without assumptions about how consumers and manufacturers are incentivized. Like for the automakers, how do we incentivize them to produce accessible low-end electric vehicles? Right now, low-end electric vehicle is an oxymoron. So anyway, tell me what sort of policy tool utilization assumptions that you made in developing these scenarios.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So this toolkit is really about technology, energy, and emissions drivers. So it actually doesn't start with the policy and more starts with the fundamentals of what would we need to do, what's the right level of ambition to get to the emissions targets set out by the CLCPA. So you're right that it starts with technology by design to help us understand that level of effort. We don't have cost results or macroeconomic results to share for this work yet, although I know that that is a key directive under the CLCPA and will be a key part of continued engagement with the advisory panels. So I'll just note that will happen. And I think that this is a starting point to help us then understand what are the policies and incentive mechanisms that could help us achieve the types of levels of effort that we've outlined in these pathways. And then what you can do is have an iterative process where we say, here are the types of policies and incentive mechanisms that can help you achieve this level of adoption. Or if we think that's not realistic, you can revise the estimates within these scenarios. So I expect that that'll be part of the conversation as we continue down the road. But to date, we don't have any specific policy outcomes of this analysis.
But just worthy of comment that as you started out, you mentioned that we can get there with existing technologies. So, I would wager a bet that the scenario trajectories depend a great deal on how the financing of things like how we retool all our buildings is done. So, one might guess that those scenario trajectories are going to change a great deal as you fold in the economic part of the analysis, correct?
That's right. And I think one of the other challenges for doing costs is that there's so many different outlooks for example, the cost of an electric vehicle over the next 5 years or 10 years that range from really optimistic to really conservative. And a lot of the consumer adoption will depend on both the economics of technology and what incentive mechanisms might exist for the exact amount that a consumer is going to pay on the hood for a new vehicle. So it will depend on consumer choice as well as economics for exactly what that trajectory will look like.
And Paul, thank you for the question. I just want to add a couple other comments to clarify. So, again, the point of saying that the technology pathway is possible is really important to make sure that we are grounded in achievement that is possible and that we can have confidence in. However, I think everyone would note, and we certainly note and expect there will be technology innovation that will change these scenarios quite a bit. That's what we have seen. If you look back 5 years, let alone 10 years, or the 30 years between now and 2050, you see dramatic changes. We know that will occur. This is grounded in current scenarios and says we can meet the requirements of the Act. However, innovation will only do, make us better for providing additional options at lower cost, better options, et cetera, along the way. The others is, in terms of the policies that you were asking about, I just want to note again, and I tried to frame this at the beginning, I think the policy choices for how to incentivize some of these transitions will have to find their discussion and ultimately adoption through the work of the advisory panels, and then into the scoping plan that will really make recommendations about the policy mechanism. So that's work ahead. This is again meant to be foundational to understand what these backcasting scenarios show us. I'm going to call on another member of the council now. Raya Salter, do you want to go next, please?
Oh, sure. Thank you. What a fascinating and interesting analysis. I'm looking forward to deeply engaging on it. I just had a curiosity. Supply aside, is there in this bottom-up emissions pathway analysis, what were the geographic considerations over time? And was there any, geographic considerations, and was there a temporal analysis with that too?
Right, so we're looking at New York State as a whole, and then we model New York State in 2 zones. We have upstate and downstate New York, and then we model every year between 2020 through 2050. And then within electricity in particular, we model hourly impacts just to try to understand reliability in particular, where that requires additional temporal granularity. Some additional assumptions about how New York then kind of participates with neighbors, especially within the electricity system, because the electricity grid doesn't stop at New York's borders. So it's a little bit of a mix where the focus has been on the state at a pretty high level. And when there's more detailed data input, sometimes we're integrating county level data, even though the model is kind of at that upstate and downstate regional level.
Very broadly geographic, interesting, and I guess not a lot of demographics at this point in terms of people.
Right, so we do model kind of different types of households, but those are kind of single family versus multifamily households rather than, low income, middle income, high income.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next, Bob Howarth.
Thank you, Alicia. Can you hear me? Okay, and thank you, Tori, for that overview. It was, I think it's a great start. I did have a couple of comments and a question related to it. One of the things I work on is methane emissions and greenhouse gas accounting, and I actually have a paper that's going to be published in a few weeks looking at how the CLCPA accounting works. So, you know, my analysis would suggest that your overall approach is going to be pretty robust, but when we start accounting for methane emissions, the housing sector, the commercial building sector is going to become much more important relative to other sectors. So just heads up, I think we need to be concentrating on that. For both that sector and the transportation, you talked about the need for consumer buy-in and consumers there, and that's when we get to incentives and policies. And of course, one of the policies I think we should be considering is a carbon fee on both carbon dioxide and methane. And this is a question for my colleagues on the council. If we leave that discussion just to the panels, I'm a little worried about that because we'll have a different panel for housing and one for transportation, and the carbon fee is a cross-cutting incentive that I think applies to both. But my question goes, you highlighted the importance of that window in the winter when we might not have enough renewable electricity to meet the demand, particularly if we go to more heat pumps, and I agree that's a huge concern. Have you considered the increased use of thermal storage within buildings? I've heard that that's relatively cost effective relative to some of the other considerations you put up, and I'm just wondering if that's part of your calculus. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that thoughtful question. We haven't included a ton of thermal storage in this analysis in particular, but I think it's something that we should talk about in the advisory panel context, about whether there are additional things that we should be considering within a full portfolio of options.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'll go to Ann Reynolds next, please.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had a few questions. One was if you could take a minute, Tori, to explain the differences in the two scenarios again, the high-tech availability and the non-energy limited, just so I can understand more what would have to happen to have that second scenario be likely. I was wondering, too, if you evaluated longer duration storage. You mentioned that it was a challenge, but I didn't know if it was included in there as one of the scenarios. You also said you need firm dispatchable capacity like bioenergy or hydroelectric. I was wondering if the amount of renewables that you cited for upstate and downstate assumed a certain amount of that firm dispatchable capacity, or if you had that, and if so, how much? And if you had that, though, there'd be less renewables required. Also, I was wondering, this is more in the way of observations. There just seems to be so much focus for understandable reasons on electricity, and so much great progress has been made, but transportation seems to be still lacking in terms of us being started on the way towards these pathways. Even the high, even your scenario showed in 2020, you need a high level of beginning of purchasing electric vehicles. And I just really feel like it's worth mentioning that we need something like the Transportation Climate Initiative in New York to begin along that path for transportation. I'm just struck each time I see a presentation of this type, how much more mature all the policy development is on the electricity side, which is great. But there needs to be some movement on transportation. And lastly, I was struck by something you said. One of the charts showed that the non-combustion emissions are so much more challenging to achieve. The emissions reductions are so much more challenging to achieve. I think this was the first slide when you started going through the sectoral results. And especially you mentioned waste. And I just wonder if that tells us that we need to have a special focus on waste, or some sort of work group working on waste now, knowing that it's one of those challenges. So those are my 3 questions and 2 observations. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for those. So I wrote those down, so hopefully I'll capture each of the questions. In terms of the differences between the two scenarios, I'll just note that I know we mainly focused on the detailed results for only one of the two scenarios, just in the interest of time. There'll be full documentation posted that'll have full results of both scenarios for those that want to dive in more deeply. But I'd say at a high level, the key difference between those two scenarios, the high technology availability case is focusing on the levels of adoption kind of at natural replacement of technologies. So basically, you're not buying back old, less efficient appliances. You're kind of assuming this natural rate of rollover of your existing infrastructure. And that scenario assumes that we have the higher end of our natural and working lands carbon sink, so higher level of carbon storage in the state's soils and forests, as well as higher levels of reduction for non-combustion categories. The second scenario, limited non-energy, has more limited natural and working land sink, so the lower end of the carbon sink and the lower end of reductions for non-energy, non-combustion. And then if those are lower, then we compensate with higher levels of adoption in transportation, buildings in particular, where then you would have to potentially buy back older, less efficient equipment to accelerate that transformation. So we showed, I think, ranges on that timeline slide that showed kind of the low and high end of those two scenarios. So the levels of adoption that we talked about spanned the levels of adoption in those two scenarios. On the electricity side, you're asking about long duration storage. So, the firm dispatchable capacity is kind of the broad umbrella term, and a variety of different things could step in and serve that role. And probably a mix of several technologies would step in and serve that role. So longer duration storage. So right now when we model batteries, we're talking about being able to store energy for 4 or maybe 8 hours. But longer duration storage technology is largely kind of not been demonstrated at scale, but there are many companies that are working on it. So I would put that in kind of the innovation bucket where hopefully there's continued innovation and that would be able to step in and be part of that solution. But what we are trying to model is with today's technology, what would be included. And so that mix of technologies that I mentioned, kind of using existing generators to combust bioenergy or hydrogen, using hydroelectric power, nuclear or carbon capture and storage. Those are proven technologies and a mix of those could be included. And we have included a mix of those technologies. So the amounts of renewables that I quoted kind of do include a small role for that mix of technologies. And it's probably worth noting that, since we're really just talking about these small winter periods throughout the year, we have a lot of those systems, for example, bioenergy that's being combusted in existing gas generators, where we have the capacity sitting around, but they only run a very small share of the year just to serve that need. So it's kind of this niche role that in addition to the big players of wind and solar that are generating throughout the year and providing the majority of the electricity generation for New York, we have this small role for firm dispatchable capacity. And there is a mix of those technologies I mentioned serving that role in these scenarios.
Thank you.
I think I answered those questions, but let me know if I missed anything.
Okay, so moving forward, we have a few more council members who have raised their hands, and I just wanted to also ask a favor of the council members after your question is answered, if you can click that button again to put your hand down so that we'll know next time you have a question, that will help. You have to actually do that. I didn't realize that, but you have to do that. I'm sorry, I think, did I mute myself in the middle of that? Okay, I'm calling on Peter Iwanowitz next.
Great, thanks, Tori. Great presentation. I really appreciate it, and thanks. 2 quick questions for you. What role did you guys envision for vehicle-to-grid technologies with battery-powered EVs sort of playing a role in energy storage, if any? And I'm just really curious, you sprinkled throughout the presentation a lot of talk about biofuels, and I'm trying to sort of wrestle with the concept, knowing that the spirit of this work that we're doing, as the Commissioner Sago said at the outset of our discussions, sort of grounded in sort of environmental and climate justice. And there's been a lot of concern about the use of biofuels there. So I'm just sort of curious, what have you explored in terms of biofuels and their relative impacts on the environment and the social and economic justice impact of those biofuels?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so within the transportation sector, we basically assume that, a large share of the electric vehicles are able to charge really flexibly throughout the day. So we see that there's a pretty huge potential for that for electric vehicles, a smaller potential for that for buildings. But for vehicles, we see the potential to potentially shift when they charge, up to 12 hours over the course of the day, based on driving patterns and grid technology. So that does kind of play a similar role as some of our battery storage in terms of being able to move power from one part of the day where we might have been demanding it to a separate part of the day. And then the separate question on bioenergy is a big one. So I'll take an initial stab at it, and there may be follow-up questions. But the first is that, we've used kind of this accounting framework for bioenergy that's consistent with the current greenhouse gas inventory and IPCC protocols, which treats kind of biogenic sources of fuel as zero carbon or carbon neutral from a life cycle perspective. So we see, combusting renewable natural gas as kind of being a zero carbon fuel from a life cycle perspective, which is something that may require some additional attention under what the exact accounting principles would be under the CLCPA. But our approach has been to try to think about what are the amount of sustainable biomass feedstocks that would exist locally within New York State. And we've looked at a variety of different data sources to try to understand what those feedstocks would be, and then allocate that bioenergy to sectors that are really difficult to mitigate. So we see a role for bioenergy, and this is kind of advanced bioenergy where we're producing advanced kind of drop-in fuels rather than traditional corn ethanol or biodiesel, but largely an advanced renewable natural gas, renewable diesel that could be a drop-in fuel to help us decarbonize aviation, long-haul trucking, marine, industry, as well as potentially serving that role in those tough winter periods within our electricity sector. The low carbon fuels umbrella could also cover things like hydrogen being produced through clean electricity, which is an alternative to bioenergy and doesn't have kind of the same life cycle accounting question since that burns at the tailpipe clean. Does that answer the question?
It does. Just a quick flag for all of us that when we're burning biofuels, we also have to be cognizant of the requirements under the CLCPA for co-pollutants, particularly where they're combusted. So GHG and life cycle emissions analyses aren't going to be sufficient when we look at those fuels under our scenarios here in New York State. It's a little bit different because we have the co-pollutant thing. Just one real quick follow-up, sorry. The number of vehicles, did you guys anticipate a reduction in total vehicle fleet?
So over time, we actually assume that the total number of vehicles in the state is increasing as population is increasing. But the vehicle miles traveled per person may be reduced due to some of those measures that I mentioned.
So we're going to have more than 11.2 million vehicles we have on the roads today?
That's what we're modeling, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Donna DeCarolis next, please. Donna?
Thanks, Alicia. You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I'm really interested in reading it more thoroughly after the meeting. A few follow-ups, and they echo some of the comments already made. One is, I was really pleased actually to see the inclusion of and the discussion around RNG and things like hydrogen blending. And I was curious, I guess it's a follow-up to Peter in a way, how do we see that being studied as the work of this council progresses? So that's one. And maybe a little bit more, if you could, Tori, about how significant it is here in your modeling. My second one was around energy efficiency. Really interesting to see. I think what I saw was 55 to 58% of energy efficiency / conservation. I think it was by 2050. It was hard to write fast enough, but I think that's what I saw. So I was curious to hear more about what the drivers were there and some of the methods that are leading those kind of numbers, because those are great. And then the third was echoing earlier remarks about the cost benefit analysis. I'm curious, and I guess you sort of answered it, but how will that be included and how does it impact the customer adoption rates for some of the technologies that we're talking about? And then lastly, sort of a follow-up to Raya's question. We talked about regional differences. Did you consider the coldest climates in the state, or do you think that's accounted for in the regions that you already identified? So thank you.
Great. I think I got everything, but you'll have to let me know if I miss anything. For renewable natural gas and hydrogen, so those have kind of a different role across the economy. I think, the blending levels that we assume by 2050 is somewhere between 10 and 20% of pipeline gas could be renewable natural gas. The role for hydrogen that we see is largely in long haul trucking, kind of our big trucking industry, as well as some industry where we may want to displace some of the fossil combustion with hydrogen. Although I think that's certainly something that we can discuss in terms of the role for those fuels and utilization across different sectors. The level of energy efficiency that we've assumed, is, in buildings and industry is a combination of different types of measures. So we're assuming that, there are appliance codes and standards that makes, appliances more efficient over time if you buy a new appliance today versus 10 years ago. We also assume that people are potentially switching to Energy Star options or equivalent, kind of switch to the highest efficiency option. We assume there's behavioral conservation and smart devices, people having programmable thermostats and switches on their lights to turn them off when they're not in the room. And we also assume really aggressive adoption of improved building shell and insulation type categories so that the homes in general and buildings in general are better insulated and have better use of energy. And this is true for both new construction and retrofits across the state for residential and commercial buildings. So there are a variety of different types of energy efficiency that we see playing a role there. For cost benefit analysis, the tool, even though we don't have cost results to share today, the toolkits that I've described do have the ability of doing some cost benefit analysis. And so that's something that we expect to be working with the advisory panels to figure out within that large band of uncertainty of technology costs and how much should EVs cost in 30 years, how much should heat pumps cost, how much should wind, solar, battery storage cost, to help find decent assumptions within that space to test a full cost benefit analysis with scenarios like these. And then finally, cold climate heat pump performance, I think, or maybe just cold climates in general. In particular for space heating, we have tried to reflect the climates across the whole state. So we have reflected the performance of electric space heating technology, which is really sensitive to temperature in terms of the efficiency degrading as it gets colder. We have reflected the climates of different climate zones within New York State.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question is from Gavin Donahue. And before I turn it over to Gavin, just to note, if there are any other questions from the council, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, this is going to be the last question so that we can keep to agenda and keep the meeting moving forward.
Thank you, Alicia. I hope everybody can hear me. I want to commend Commissioner Sagos and Alicia for having this presentation put out, because the issue of science matters. Commissioner Sagos has said repeatedly, and Alicia talked about informed analysis and real-time data. This study is a true objective study, I believe, of what is needed to consider achieving these goals, which are Herculean, to say the least. Having a kitchen sink approach to new technologies is very important. What comes out of the stack is what's important, not what goes into the stack from an environmental compliance standpoint. At least that's the way I view it. And when you look at today's law, the technologies like carbon capture, sequestration, biofuels to comply with the CLCPA are not allowed under the law. So if we're going to achieve these things, we need to take a second look at the CLCPA law to invest in these new technologies. We should not be limiting innovation in this process. The other two observations I have, and I apologize for bouncing around, is, Tori, can you give me the definition of what you were looking at as what is considered dispatchable resources? That's one thing, and then I'll be quiet after this. There's issues surrounding grid reliability, modernization of the transmission system, intermittency of renewables, curtailment issues at different times of the day, a lot of stuff that deals with reliability, because at the end of the day, this is about reliability and keeping the lights on. I would encourage this overview and this study to marry up with some of the studies the ISO has done particularly a Brattle study that talks about zero emissions in 2040. Somehow these studies that are all competing with each other need to mirror themselves up. And that's more of a request of the state of New York. But Tori, the issue of dispatchable resources and technology development is really important to me. So I'd like to hear what that is considered.
Yeah, good question. And I know that it's a mouthful of buzzwords that I was saying there. So I was talking about firm dispatchable generation, and I was actually also talking about firm dispatchable and zero emissions technology, because we're talking about a system in 2040 that needs to be zero emission. So the list of technologies that I was running through there are all technologies that basically are available on demand to be able to ramp up and serve electricity demands in those winter periods. And so our intermittent renewables don't qualify for being firm, dispatchable, zero carbon resources, because they're dependent on when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing. And so the list that I had provided was things like zero emissions combustible fuels, so bioenergy if those are deemed eligible, hydrogen produced from clean sources, then nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and hydroelectric power are all firm, dispatchable, zero emissions technologies. And then there may be others through innovation that are also able to step in and play a role, like other forms of long duration storage. But we didn't include those in kind of today's technology that fit the bill.
Thank you, Tori. And we do have an additional question from Dennis Elsenbeck. Dennis?
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, Tori, I just want to make sure I understood the issue of our move to electrification. And it sounded like you said that we could be facing like a 65 to 80% increase in demand. And I just wanted to verify that and really thinking about it in the context of the stress that will place on local infrastructure, especially in the areas that we're focused on, which are disadvantaged communities who already face aged infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, and also a lack of capacity, that is kind of very much localized. And then really thinking about how your assessment looks at some of the original tenets of the Reforming the Energy Vision process, which sought to co-locate supply and demand, and looking at, what are the environmental benefits of these large-scale farms versus location-based alternative energy, including hydrogen as a potential, not just for transportation, but for very localized generation and supply to match localized demand to mitigate some of our infrastructure investments, which in my humble estimation is going to be significant based on the trajectory that we're currently on. So it's really a view of more of a location-based integrated resource planning strategy that I'm trying to understand how you assess the, location-based solutions, which is all part of the VEDR, versus kind of like the path we're on, where we're just looking at or predominantly looking at large-scale alternatives. So just wanted to make those as a thought and get your comments.
Yeah, thanks for the comments and question. So on electrification, you did hear that right, that we're looking at 65 to 80% higher electricity demands on an annual basis in 2050 compared to today. That's different from peak impacts, which the full results of kind of our peak impact analysis are available in the appendix slides here and in the reports. So that is two separate questions about infrastructure for the electricity system, both of which are really important. In terms of local infrastructure, the limits of this analysis are that so far we've really only broken this down into upstate and downstate, which doesn't really let us do the full deep dive into local communities or even New York City versus Long Island. And so I think this type of an analysis can be a helpful starting point to then say, what would that mean for more local infrastructure, both thinking about local distribution infrastructure or electrification, as well as local supply side infrastructure for where distributed solar might be located, or local generators. But I would say kind of the local supply side piece wasn't the primary screen for the least cost capacity expansion that was done. It was primarily thinking about what's the least cost way that we could serve hourly electricity demands upstate and downstate through this mix of resources and meet the emissions and electric sector goals that the state has set forth.
I actually appreciate that clarification, because if we're looking at a 40% spend in our to benefit our disadvantaged communities, we got to get more granular, because those are the areas that will struggle with smart growth, which is backfilling economic development, community revitalization, so that we're actually developing very localized solutions. If we don't look at it that way, you have a tendency of overbuilding your infrastructure and overbuilding your supply side to meet a percentage goal without understanding what the localized demand is. So I appreciate that clarification.
Thank you, and thanks, Tori, for sticking with all of these questions. I am going to give actually the last word or last question from the council before we move to the next agenda item to NYPA's CEO, Gil Quinones.
Thank you, Alicia, and welcome everyone. Great study. I think this gives us a different trajectories and options to our end in mind, along with specific milestones in 2030, 2035. So it's not a question in the spirit of continuous improvement. I know this is just the beginning of this analysis and modeling process that we should engage the New York State utilities, the New York ISO, entities like EPRI, maybe national labs, some select national labs and university research centers and technology companies, just to make sure as we improve these models that it is in harmony with the laws of physics and electrical engineering and good utility practice. That's one. And then the other area of potential enhancements and improvement will be something that you already mentioned, which is on costs and the macroeconomic dynamic, especially cost vis-a-vis consumer adoption rates. That's all. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alicia.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Tori and Snu for the excellent presentation and thoughtful responses to the questions. As we said in teeing up this conversation, this is just the beginning of a lot of work ahead and a lot of opportunity for discussion as we get into the work of the advisory panels and the council going forward, which is exactly what we're going to turn to next. Next slide. We need to switch back to the other presentation, actually. And then I will hand it back over to Basil to kick us off for the next section.
Let's take it from the top. Oh, listen, while we're getting that queued up, I think we just get right into it. Since we're a little bit behind, I'll just breeze through a couple of my intro slides, which I think some of you or all of you have already seen at this point. Just a couple of quick points up front on our panels. First of all, we definitely have to have urgency into the decisions on selecting the panelists. That's something that we want to do in earnest over the next few weeks, so that perhaps at the next meeting, we can have a full vote on as many of these panels as possible. So that's number one. That urgency is important. Number two, though, the panels have to be right. They have to have the right composition substantively and also diversity. They've got to have a reflection of the diversity of the state. Yes, we have, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, the Climate Justice Working Group. We've got the Environmental Justice Advisory Group. But again, we need to have expertise within the panels themselves. So if you'd go through a couple of these, again, I will not, if anyone wants to see these, we can go back to them, but you have already seen them and you have them. Let's go to the transportation slide. If you'd click through to that slowly. And this is just the process. The third point I'd want to make, the very important point on all of this, is public engagement. And all of the panels are to have a public engagement process, public comment, public meeting, however we intend to define it, at least one forum, at least one engagement formally, but perhaps more as needed. On transportation, so we had this great presentation on pathways, and I think just generally pathways is an enormous amount of factual and scientific evidence that can then inform all of the various panels. And the panels can, of course, go beyond that to obtain more information. But the pathways analysis fits very nicely into the work of the panels. We'll start on transportation. As Anne, I believe, mentioned, yes, transportation does account for some of the largest share of emissions, and we need to do work on that front. We have been doing work through the governor's initiatives and state of the state, whether it's the 5 upstate transit fleets, MTA moving to all electric, buses by 2040, investments through Volkswagen, investments in other realms. But this is clearly a major aspect of what we need to consider, the pathways to set us on to a good track. I know there's going to be a good discussion about this, but I want to bring in Commissioner Dominguez to specifically talk about that, and then we'll do just like we did with pathways, entertain some Q&A on this, and ultimately, move as quickly as we can into the next one, so we don't lose too much time today.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Basil, and I want to thank you and Alicia for your unwavering commitment to reducing carbon emissions and mitigating the resulting harmful effects of climate change. And you guys have been great as chairs here, leading us forward. And I just want to take a personal moment to thank Alicia for all of her great work. She's been a great partner, and sorry to lose her to the team, but wish her well as she moves on. So with the Department of Transportation, we know very well the harmful impacts that more frequent and intense extreme weather have on our state's infrastructure and our economy, which is why we've had such a focus on resilient infrastructure, incorporating all kinds of enhancements into our standards and everything that we build. But we also understand and appreciate that the transportation sector is indeed one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases. So with that, the state's made tremendous strides, as you referenced, Basil, to mitigating the growth of those emissions. And in fact, as a result of the state's sustained investment in public transportation services statewide, we've had more than which has basically been about $6 billion annually. New York uses the least energy per capita for transportation purposes than any other state in the nation. And in addition to this unparalleled support that we receive from the state, the department is also committed to more than $1 billion in infrastructure improvements over the last several years to reduce single vehicle occupancy use and to increase the movement of goods by means other than trucks. And that includes strategic investments in seaports and freight rail. So DOT is committed to helping not only achieve the governor's climate leadership goals through our impactful infrastructure investments and reducing transportation's carbon footprint writ large, but we'll also be looking very specifically not only at the work that we've done, but also an assessment of the impacts on all of our projects, whether that's materials, supply chain, any element of the work that we do going forward. And this is specific to the department. But given that much of the emissions that's generated from the transportation sector occurs outside of the state's control, as the Climate Action Council advances, we really want to and very much welcome the input from our fellow council members on additional strategies that we might undertake to make the transportation system ready to facilitate policies that will truly inform individual choice. That includes fleets and vehicles. So the Pathways presentation was indeed illustrative and outlined numerous points of data and information for us to build from. And I think we have nothing but opportunity moving forward. And I think we've got a good collaboration in place to make that happen. I very much appreciated Tori's presentation. And as I said, I think we've got a good path forward that we'll develop as we develop with the panel in the advisory panel. But I also want to reference something that you talked about at the beginning, Basil, and that's we've done a lot and we've learned a lot, and we've learned a lot literally in the last 115 days, how quickly behaviors can shift, how quickly recognition of our climate and our social disparities can become so very important in a way that we've always known, but clearly things that we can learn from in this truly foundational moment that we're in. So I think we're learning that all of this, as you referenced, Basil, is things that we're fundamentally better prepared to address, looking at the crisis that we're presently in. But I think it puts us in a good position to address the climate crisis that we're in. So moving forward, I very much look forward to working with all of you to do exactly that, address the challenges that we have up before us. They're vast, but I think they're very doable. So.
Great. Well, thanks, Marie-Therese. I see one question, one hand up. Gil, you still have your hand up. That's fine. But Dennis, you're up.
Hazel, thank you. And thanks, Marie. I have one question, and I noticed this also in Tori's presentation, is that we don't mention construction vehicles, probably an industry that has least adopted renewable energy or zero energy sources. So I would just, ask that we start to consider the construction vehicle side, which is predominantly diesel.
We are at the department, for purposes of our fleet and our assets, we are doing exactly that. And in leading by example, we hope to do more of that and look for additional ways that we can do, spread that throughout the industry, because I hear you loud and clear.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Anne?
Yeah, hi. Two things to mention. One was also lead by example, something that you mentioned about looking specifically at DOT's own projects, which I think is really important to do. So is the state's purchase of electric vehicles, not just DOT, but all the agencies. And I know how hard that is to do. But I do think it's really important, and I just wanted to highlight that there is another part of the climate law that is about the state's own lead by example and the state's own procurement. And I think that maybe as a pathway, it might be a relatively small part of it, but as a education and experience and setting a good example, it's super important. So I wanted to state my support for that. Second, I don't know if it's, polite to bring up money, but like what we've learned in the last 100 days, we've also learned that the state has some real challenges ahead of it with its own budget. And that has an effect on this, in my mind, because of how renewable energy is funded. That has an effect on this panel more than others, because there does need to be a source of funding for all of this good work to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And I know Transportation Climate Initiative is one way to create that revenue stream. There are others, I'm sure, but I just feel like we might want to consider having the question of how to fund this transportation work be another assignment for the Transportation Advisory Panel.
Good suggestion, and we'll definitely take that as a to-do.
Yeah, and no question, Ann, you know, I don't know that we know what we're facing yet on the budget side. It's not due until mid-July. The state's fiscal picture is already somewhat grim. The question as to whether or not we get any money out of the federal government to offset state and local losses is still out there. I would say as a plea to everyone on the phone, obviously, or on WebEx, to please pressure your federal electeds to focus on the states and the focus on the shortfall, the budget shortfall at the states, because that translates directly into the things that we care about. And the governor has said that we want the clean energy economy to lead the way, and we want to be the lead state on that. But you know, there's certainly short-term concerns on the budget side that we don't need to spend all our time on right now, but nonetheless are very real.
Basil, I build off of one. So that's a great point. Because there are numerous paths here on the federal side to help on not just literally support for states, but funding. And one of the things that is occurring literally this week and has for the last couple of weeks is a surface transportation bill that the Congress is considering. And there are numerous climate provisions that are included in there. So take a look at that as well. There's some real opportunity that would certainly benefit New York moving forward. And we've been big proponents of that. So.
Great. Good point. Peter, you have a question?
Maybe it's more of a comment, but thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate it. And thank you, Marie, Commissioner Dominguez, for the overview there. And Anna's raised a couple of different times the concept of the Transportation Climate Initiative as a potential way to fund electrification. And I think, you know, Bob Howarth had raised it earlier. At some point, we have to sort of figure out, you know, where these discussions will happen. Is it in the working group panels, or are they part of our discussions as a council? Setting a polluter penalty, a fee, a tax on carbon intensive fuels is probably one of the areas where we should have that cross sectionality and of different pathways. So there's probably different ways to get there. And I think we're also going to have to harmonize the social and equity goals of the CLCPA and try to figure out how those you know, get discussed and evaluated with different panel strategies that go on as well.
They're both good points, and I did hear Anna mention that earlier on the TCI front. I mean, I will tell you that between DEC and DOT, we have been robust players, I'll say, at the TCI table, and I realize that that's an entire Northeastern coalition effort. But there's definitely various venues, various paths that we can take. I think the work that we undertake with this Climate Action Council will be something that's very specific to New York. So I look forward to working with you all on all of that.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that, because I know our brothers and sisters in the climate justice movement are not all that enamored with TCI. So as long as there are other options on the table, I think we'll be able to meet the Commissioner Segos's goals, sort of, you know, equity and justice for climate justice going forward.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And thanks, Marie-Trace. Alicia, turn it back to you on power generation.
Yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? And so I'm not going to, following Basil's lead, and obviously in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the overview, because we did discuss this previously, but obviously this is a critical piece of work given the structure that we've talked about earlier, where you know, decarbonizing the electricity generation sector is a key strategy, and one in which we've already made substantial progress in terms of advancing strategies and policies as well as projects. But there are, you know, remaining important questions that this advisory panel will be wrestling with. And I was hoping to ask Chairman of the Public Service Commission, John Rhodes, to include a few comments about the work of the Power Generation Advisory Panel, given his role in helping lead that advisory panel.
Thanks, Alicia. Can folks hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Great. So, yes. So I think you've alluded to this, or that you know, the power sector needs to deliver a lot, and I think you've also alluded to the fact that this is a stream of work that's already been going on for some time, and in fact, just recently, we both put out the white paper that you mentioned, which is a proposal on how to get to 70 by 30, as called for in the CLCPA, as well as transmission unlocking initiatives that are called for by the Accelerated Renewables Growth and Community Benefit Act, both on the local side and imminently on the bulk side. My own commitment is that we're not jumping the gun in front of the panel and in front of the advisory committee, but that we're making progress where it needs to be made, and we're counting on the council and the panel to shape the overall direction as we make progress. And it's already clear from the questions that we all blessed Tori with, that this is a pretty sophisticated group when it comes to electricity. We do know that we need more innovation in this sector. We've already mentioned some of the needs, so thermal storage, vehicle to grid, long duration storage. We also know that how we grow the load will matter a lot, or how we shape the future of the load. Electric vehicles are going to be a demand on the system. Electrified buildings will be a demand on the system. Energy efficiency and conservation will be a response. Demand response will be a response to it. So we need to have a comprehensive view. We know that what resources we need, kind of. We know we need more clean generation. We know we need more transmission for that clean generation. We know we need flexibility to handle the strains on the grid. Gavin didn't need to remind us that we need to worry about reliability and cost effectiveness. But we also need to focus even more than we have on issues of equity, issues of access to clean energy solutions for all New Yorkers and all communities in New York, for making sure that affordability stays in place. You know, COVID has reminded us that these tough developments in the world hit the most vulnerable communities the hardest in an extremely and intolerably unfair way. And we can't have this transition add to that burden. We need to maintain affordability. And of course, I think Dennis mentioned that there's a REV idea that we should be locational. And I think environmental justice absolutely wants to be locational. In the most burdened neighborhoods, there's a reason for that burden, and why don't we attack those reasons as we go through this transition? So that's where we're headed. We think we have the direction right. We know with the input that we're going to get from all New Yorkers, channeled to a meaningful degree through the panel and the Climate Action Council, will make even better progress. I'm ready to pledge an open and inclusive process to get there. So those are my opening remarks. And Alicia, I don't know if there are questions or hand raised.
Yes.
But,
Yes, thank you, Chair Rhodes. Ann Reynolds has a question for you.
Good.
So in this case, my question is just a thank you. We'll have plenty of time to get into the details of the 70% proceeding in that proceeding, but I just wanted to say how impressive it is that the state's moving ahead with this. It has moved ahead on this in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And so both this and New York Sun and that focus on low-income solar, I just wanted to say thank you and appreciate it.
Thank you, Anne. And Dennis?
Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. And John, thanks for the comments. On the load management side, it's part of this premise. How do you see it? I mean, and I don't want to get into detail, but what's your impression of being more creative on the time of use end, which is actually very supportive of location-based solutions in support of certain technologies?
We should do it. I think that technology will help. I don't want to, it's not a cop out, but I think that once we have more of a sophisticated metering infrastructure, basically an information infrastructure, consumers will be able to, people will be able to manage load on their premises a lot better. And once they do that, we should give them incentives so that what they do makes sense for them and for the grid. I think we're in better shape on the big customer side than on the mass market side. And some of the innovations that we've talked about are really like vehicle to grid and the different kinds of storage are actually really about flexibility for dynamic load management. So we need it. We kind of generally know the direction. We'll benefit from innovation. We'll benefit from advice.
John.
Thank you. And can we go to the next slide, please? So the next advisory panel is Housing and Energy Efficiency Advisory Panel. This really is a broad scope of work encompassing all building types from residential to commercial and industrial, the public sector as well. And ultimately, the scoping plan is going to address the building sector in its entirety. And, this reinforces, the need for this panel to look comprehensively, as well as maintain a strong focus on housing and affordability, which is obviously another critical and interrelated state policy matter, that is tied up in so many of the issues we've been discussing today. And I would like to welcome, probably the most authoritative voice in the state on that topic to help us frame the work of the Housing and Energy Efficiency Advisory Panel. Commissioner Wisniewski, are you on with us still?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Thanks, Ruth Ann. Great.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Basil. I'm delighted to be here, and this has been great. Just to context set a little bit, there are about 7 million housing units across the state, so it's not a small footprint by any stretch. Our housing stock in the state is about half rental and half home ownership. It's a little more home ownership. And it's old, right? Across the state, almost half, more than half of the housing units are pre-1960 in construction. And so there's a lot to do in terms of upgrades. In terms of the technology piece, at HDR, we're not the expert on heat pumps and other building technologies. And so we're certainly looking to the advisory panel for guidance across the board, not just sort of in the work that we do as an agency, but across the state on building technologies that are impactful, but also thinking about making sure that those technologies don't make housing less affordable. So obviously there's the affordable units that we regulate as the state housing agency. There's public housing authorities. There's a lot of local government regulated, but affordable housing, but there's also a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. So I think we want to make sure that that stock, while it gets new technologies and it doesn't become unaffordable as a result of that. And as I had said on the maturity of the stock, The median age of buildings in New York City alone is about 75 years. Over 80% of the buildings in the city, which houses a little less than half the population, is quite old. And so I think we want to make sure there's a balance and a real focus on preservation and retrofits as much as there is on new construction. Some of this stuff can be a little easier when we talk about new construction, but I think we want to make sure that we focus on retrofitting our existing stock as well. So I would just leave it at that and say we're really excited to be part of this.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I see that that Bob Howarth has his hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Alicia. I noticed here and in the other panels that there's a big emphasis again on technologies and strategies. And to hark back to some of the earlier comments, I think we need to start addressing the policy drivers of this. So again, a carbon fee, but also in the context of the building systems. I totally agree with you that the retrofit needs to be done and done well, and it's a huge challenge. But for new construction, I would think that the state should move as rapidly as possible to simply ban the use of fossil fuels in new construction, as has been done, say, in Denmark. It's a very cost-effective way to start moving us ahead. So it's not a technology per se, but it's a policy. And will those sort of things be discussed by the panel, or is that something that the council as a whole will be taking up? So, thank you.
Sure. Ruth Ann, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
I mean, I definitely would say, 100%, those are the kinds of things we'll be talking about. I think we always want to make sure, as we sort of ban things, to use your word, that there is enough supply across the state to be able to produce whatever it is that we're replacing those with. I mean, so the example of the heat pump is one, right? There's sort of a lot of talk about we need to switch to heat pumps. We need to make sure that our builders understand what those are, that there's enough people who are trained in how to both install those and also how to maintain them from a management perspective. So I 100% agree that government should drive, and I think that's why this conversation is so important, and we're so happy to be part of it. But I think there's also a little bit of a curve where we want the industry to make sure that we can both get the supply and have people who can, design and install and maintain. But 100%, I think that's part of this conversation.
And Bob, we could take the conversation offline, but I would note for the benefit of the council that the state is running a number of programs aimed at net zero emissions in the new construction building sector to push that advanced design based on models in Europe and elsewhere. And that's really an incentive approach as opposed to a banning approach where we, have done, taken the approach as we have, with renewable energy and otherwise to try and incentivize, the early adopters and then focus on the pathways to scaling those approaches more broadly across the economy. And, we are seeing actually that there is, particularly for certain types of building stock, really cost-effective approaches today for net zero new construction. And we've awarded a number of projects that will showcase that, and NYSERDA has. So definitely a promising area for discussion and for further work, both on the technology innovation side, because, I agree entirely that, we need to make sure that the technologies are going to deliver what's needed from every perspective, including cost perspective. But we're not waiting for that to happen on its own. We are as we so often do, pushing the envelope of innovation, launching programs and projects today. I'm going to go to the next slide.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, and we're getting late in the afternoon. So with the energy intensive and trade exposed industries panel, we are asking the panel to focus on economic issues and impact to the industry in New York State that any decarbonization approach must take account of. The pathways analysis does demonstrate that near-term opportunities may produce modest contributions from this sector. But this is, again, a place where through both policy and innovation, we would expect to try to push new ideas and strategies to try and ramp up as we look to 2050 with a contribution that would be increased from that initial assessment. So we will need the panel's expertise in evaluating what types of tools we have and to get the best input of the industries at issue. And the panel, in coordination with the Just Transition Working Group, will provide perspective on the competitive concerns of New York's industries. So in order to speak to that issue, which is core to the mission of Empire State Development, I wanted to call on Vincent Ravishir on behalf of ESD.
Thank you, Alicia. Can you hear me?
I can, Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Vincent Ravishir. I'm Senior Vice President for Energy at Empire State Development. ESD is pleased to take a leadership role on energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries. These industries are those that are likely to face the most significant challenges in the transition to a clean energy economy, but we don't want to lose them or their jobs. We stand ready to assist these companies in meeting these challenges by helping to advise them on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and connecting them with positive clean energy solutions. We look forward to working with the other members of the advisory group to fashion equitable solutions for these companies and their employees as they make this transition. Looking more broadly, we are keenly aware of the new opportunities presented by the transition to the green economy. As just one example, New York's offshore wind initiative will require the creation of a completely new industry, one that does not yet exist in this country. The state's first two projects alone, announced last year, are projected to create 1,600 direct local jobs and to generate more than $3.2 billion in economic activity. Ports will need to be redeveloped from Long Island to the Capital Region, and companies from all over the state will have opportunities to participate in the supply chain that will be created for this industry. For our part, we must ensure that the growth of this and the other clean energy industries are connected to job growth in our state and that they contribute to our efforts to provide a just transition to this new economy. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna ask to move forward to the next slide and hand it back to Basil.
Thanks, Alicia. This is the Agriculture and Forestry Advisory Panel, which is absolutely going to be part of the solution here. We're at a 22.5 million metric ton sequestration point now. We've got to increase that, no question about it. So as we talked about earlier, very briefly in Pathways, there are a number of strategies to address that and achieve that, both in sequestration as well as removal. But I'll have my good friend, Commissioner Ball, weigh in on some of that. He'll be leading this panel. Richard?
Well, thank you, friend. It's good to hear some very familiar voices and to see a few very familiar faces. First of all, friend, let me just say appreciate the extra effort from our chairs on this effort. And for Alicia, special thank you for your work, for your service, and for your friendship. As you can see here on the slide, some points with regards to the scope and the strategies we're looking at. I feel like we've been preparing for and elevating our thinking on these subjects pretty intensively over the last several years, actually. So we feel like we're in a pretty good place here. We have had great support in the EPF with funding to implement some new strategies, as we have all seen the evidence and the concerns around climate affect all of us, and very visibly agriculture, of course. Our, in particular, our efforts with climate resilient farming, and I would add that our historic working partnership and relationship with the soil and water conservation districts across the state put us in a pretty good place to have the tools and capacity to implement some of the work that I think we're going to undertake here. Just this past year, with regards to forestry, Basil, you and I shared some leadership and co-chaired the first ever Wood Products Summit. We work with the Wood Products Council. We co-chair that together. At that summit, we initiated conversations around some of these subjects that we're going to get into. I would add that we are currently reviewing a very thorough study we commissioned at Cornell on carbon farming, identifying land use practices to mitigate and to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the co-benefits that go along with that of air and water quality and increases in productivity. So I think we're in a pretty good place here. Looking forward to the work of this panel. I would just add that the level of cooperation at the cabinet level has been trending very high, certainly for the last several years, and certainly with recent events has proven to be vital, and if nothing else, even higher. So thank you, and look forward to getting to work.
Thanks, Richard. I think we have Gavin with a hand up. Gavin?
Thanks, Commissioner. Thanks, Commissioner Ball, as well. I was just going through my notes from the March 3rd meeting, and I thought it was important to get this out, that the fourth largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions is the waste sector. And the governor highlighted a number of times waste generated from landfills in the state. And I just would ask our chairs to consider putting a panel together, and touched on this earlier too, a panel on recycling waste and materials management as an effort to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions and to tackle that problem. I understand most of these panels are created in statute, but nothing precludes us from forming a new panel. And because of the large impact that those greenhouse gas emissions have on the economy, I think it's important to consider that.
Great, Gavin. Good point. Good for Ann raising that earlier as well. Absolutely, the council can create its own panels as needed over time. You can go panels, or you can go staff working groups as well. So be happy to entertain this. We can shop a few options in front of the council that would show a range of ways to approach this, but there's no question that waste emissions is something we've got to get our hands around. So thank you for raising it again. Any other questions on farming or any of the other agricultural forestry issues? Okay. Let's go to the next slide, which is land use. Very important topic, a cross-cutting topic, local government in particular, right? You're talking about buildings and putting in new forms of energy or efficiency measures in buildings. Well, that's going to involve local government land use decisions, and obviously will involve the Department of State. So we have some of these potential sectors out here: transit-oriented development. I mentioned codes. Keisha Santiago, who is Deputy Secretary of State for New York, is on with us and can walk us through some of her thinking on this.
Great, thank you. On behalf of Secretary Rosado, thank you, Commissioner Sagos, for the introduction and for framing the work of the Council and the advisory panels. I also want to thank you, President Barton, for your service to the state of New York. You indeed leave huge shoes to fill, but Doreen is a fantastic pick to continue your great work as acting president. When Governor Cuomo signed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and law into 2019, with its aggressive but necessary greenhouse gas reduction requirements, codification of renewable and clean energy goals, and a strong commitment to disadvantaged communities and environmental justice, the Department of State immediately recognized its pivotal role and raised its hand to contribute and to take its place to lead the charge. The Department of State team brings tremendous experience and passion to land use and local government advisory panels, as well as Governor Cuomo's aggressive objectives to tackle climate change head on and improve the resilience of our communities, economy, and people. We serve as the natural conduit between state agencies and local officials. We interact with them all the time, helping them identify and implement solutions best suited to their unique communities. They're not all the same. And we know that distressed environmental justice communities suffer the most from climate change and other calamities. It was clear during and after Superstorm Sandy, and most recently with COVID-19, So in tackling any major initiative or challenge, we understand the importance of working with local governments and to ensure an increased focus is placed on disadvantaged communities. And to make that happen, the commitment must be supported through local land use decisions. The way we plan as an agency and zone our communities has a tremendous impact on the energy we use and greenhouse gases we generate. With New York communities facing increased risk related to climate change, such as more intense and frequent rain events, rapid sea level rise, and greater coastal storm flooding, the breadth of programs and resources administered not just by the Department of State, but all the state's executive agencies are at your disposal to serve local governments seeking solutions across regulatory and physical infrastructure frameworks. And while the Department of State is leading this panel, we are absolutely not doing this alone. We will be engaging closely with all of our sister agencies and you through cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary collaborations, just as we always do, just as we've done with Brownfield Opportunity Area, Downtown Revitalization Initiative, and the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program, to assess impacts and identify opportunities in transportation, energy efficiency and housing, agriculture and forestry to help provide appropriate solutions. These actions will help to serve communities as they are the ones that are going to pave the way through the necessary local land use, regulation, and governance actions to meet the laudable goals of the Act. The mission of the Land Use and Local Government Committees is clear, and the perspective and input this panel provides to the other panels is instrumental for the success of the Act and the future of New York State. So thank you so very much for participating, to our participating partners who have joined with us to advance this critically important work, particularly during this unprecedented public health crisis and time of economic uncertainty. The Secretary of State and the broader team are so excited to work with you. Thank you.
Keisha, thanks. And thanks for sitting in for the Secretary. And we're lucky to have you aboard, as always, on many initiatives. I think we've got Dennis with a question.
Yeah, thanks, Basil. Keisha, thank you. And again, I want to point this out because I don't see a lot of this happening. It's an opportunity to align local government initiatives with regional economic development councils, local IDAs, local Empire State Development groups, so that we actually are aligning our priorities because many of our cities and townships lack infrastructure, yet we promote certain sites to attract economic activity, but we're not aligning the priorities of bringing in green energy solutions to help support building up capacity and infrastructure. So I would just start to include our economic development projections in this because they're very localized load demands that really would help us to co-locate these type of microgrids or community distribution so that we enhance economic activity. Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you for that comment. I will say we have been increasingly been doing that. The Secretary of State does serve a special role with regards to the REDCs. My work and my team work regularly with all of the other agencies, including economic development. And the reason why we do that is to help with alignment of those goals. But there's absolutely more to be done. And I would definitely say aligning the local government's goals with the state agencies. So we've broken down tremendous amounts of silos over the course of the last few years. And so you're right, continuing with that realignment and building off of that pace is going to be critical for this.
All right, thanks. Peter, you have something?
Yeah, thanks, Basil. Appreciate that. Just the conversation about local government just had me thinking again, and it's something I sent in as a request to think about a separate panel for involving relationships with our indigenous population here in New York State. It seems like we either need a separate panel or a focused effort there is how we harmonize our policies with working with indigenous peoples and their representatives.
Great point, Pete. That's great point. Okay, thank you. See any other questions on this panel? No. Okay. All right, thanks, Keisha. I'll just quickly turn this over to Alicia on the Just Transition Work Group. I'll just make a preliminary comment on that. I think this will be a panel or a group that we can probably move on more quickly in the next month. We've gotten some really good feedback recently on potential panelists. We want to take that and probably schedule an interim meeting in the next couple of weeks. So we'll circle back with everybody on that as a next step. But I just want to tee that up for Alicia as she gets into what this is, and Commissioner Reardon, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Basil, and I appreciate that that framing, and just want to only build on it to say the work that this group is going to do is critically important. So it's critically important that that we get the right foundation in kicking it off, and so I want to thank everybody that provided feedback, and then also reinforce the commitment to moving quickly. I also want to ask Commissioner Reardon, who will be co-chairing this working group, to provide some perspectives as she looks forward to kicking off that work as well, and has an incredible wealth of expertise and perspectives to lend to this work.
Well, thank you. And first of all, I want to take this opportunity to thank Alicia for her amazing leadership and her amazing friendship. This, I will miss you personally as well as professionally. This has really been a wonderful experience working, and you're leaving a great body of work for us to continue with. So thank you. And thank you, Basil, for your incredible chairmanship as always. This has really been this has been a great conversation. The presentation was very exciting. And I just want to say, looking at that presentation, I understand that there are some real challenges and opportunities here. It's very clear that workforce and retraining are going to be absolutely critical, because there are, brand new industries that are being set up, but also major transitions within established industries. We have opportunities to include people who have formerly been underrepresented in a lot of these industries. And we also have a great challenge in making sure that we can transition the current workers so they're not left at the curb as industries change and migrate to other ways of being utilized. So it is a big, big undertaking. I look forward to this. As you know, workforce development is very central to the Department of Labor. And this is truly an opportunity to think about, how do we engage workers? How do we retrain workers? We do have, some pathways. We do have some time frames. So it's not like flick a switch and suddenly people are in new jobs. We can actually be thoughtful and intentional in this. And of course, to be able to include other workers who might previously not have thought of these industries as places where they could have a career. It is, it is an exciting time to think about this. And I just want to think, as other people have, the last 3 months with this pandemic, the amazing changes that we've been able to go through really leads us to understand that we can move faster on some of these trajectories than we previously thought we could. Working with the energy intensive and trade exposed industries is going to be a very critical part of this transition working group. And I think that, we have an opportunity to ensure that New Yorkers are equipped for the future and have perhaps better skills than they have right now. And I look forward to working with everybody on the Just Transition Working Group and everybody on this council to make sure that everybody in New York State benefits from this future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner, and particularly for your kind words about our friendship, which I will cherish as we go forward as well. Are there any? Gosh, I don't see any hands up, so I guess we will leave that there and say stay tuned, that we will be working to advance this in the weeks ahead, as we discussed. Because we're getting so close to 5 and we do actually have another agenda topic, I'm just going to push forward and send it back to you, Basil, for you and Jared to cover the updates on the rulemakings.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. So, right, we will discuss in brief really 2 significant rulemakings we have underway right now. One is the emission limit rulemaking, and the other is the value of carbon reduction. So Jared, who is with me, and somewhat proximate distance, but also in spirit, will take those away. Jared?
Sure, and I'll really try to be quick and provide a brief summary of the progress that DEC has made on these two proceedings over the last few months. On the emission limit rulemaking, the statute requires DEC to establish the statewide emission limits for 2030 and 2050. The statute says 40% below 1990 levels and 85% below 1990 levels by 2050. Certainly the first step in establishing those limits is what were the 1990 levels? What's that baseline? And so we've been engaged in a process to determine what that baseline is so that we can use that as a basis for establishing those limits. The statute specifies some particular methodologies that we need to follow that are a change from prior approaches to emission inventories in New York. One of those is that we are to consider upstream fossil fuel emissions. So we have been working to identify what were those upstream fossil fuel emissions, emissions from fuels used for electricity generated in New York, fuels that are imported in New York for heating purposes, transportation purposes, et cetera. So that's been part of the effort. Another thing that, another requirement of the statute is we're supposed to use a 20-year global warming potential for pollutants other than CO2, which is different from the 100-year potential we've used in the past. So we've been engaged in that effort. We have reached out to stakeholders to get their input. I've heard from a number of experts and other stakeholders with their input following some webinars that we held back in February. The statute, as you see on the slide, statute also says how we're supposed to use these emission limits. They will guide the work of the council in establishing the scoping plan, basically setting up the goalposts that the council needs to plan to meet. And then following that, DEC is required to establish the regulations that will ensure that we meet these limits. And then we will be tracking progress through annual inventories. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we reached out with webinars in February. We've received a lot of feedback to that. We're considering that feedback and putting together the proposal, which will go out for public comment in August. We anticipate receiving public comment probably into October. And then we need to consider that public comment in finalizing the emission limits by the end of the year. And as you see from this slide, the first annual inventory would then be due a year later. So let me now go on to the value of carbon proceeding, and then we can take any questions at the end of that. Next slide, please. So the Climate Act also requires us to establish a value of carbon as an aid for agency decision making. So when agencies do regulations, rulemakings, permitting, policy decisions, that there is sort of a value of carbon they can use in reaching those decisions. The statute requires us to, or identifies two different approaches to be used. One is a damages approach, which we think of as the social impact of carbon. What impact does carbon have on the environment, on society? A second approach is a marginal abatement cost approach. That's an approach looking at what are the cost of reducing carbon emissions. So we will be considering those two approaches. The statute also requires us to consider a range of discount rates, including zero. which is somewhat different than other entities have done in the past. Which you usually looking at interest rates more in the range of 3 to 7%, but we will also be considering lower interest rates. We're supposed to consider the social cost of carbon in other jurisdictions, federal government, other countries, other states. And finally, the statute requires us to look at values for greenhouse gases other than CO2, so pollutants such as methane, for example. We anticipate holding a stakeholder conference to get input next month, and then we will roll out a proposed guidance document for public comment in the August-September time period, and then work to finalize that guidance document by the end of the year. So that's a quick summary of these two proceedings. I don't know if we have time for questions, if there are any.
I don't see any questions, but does anyone have any questions about all the regulatory work that's underway right now? Certainly we'll have plenty of time to review what we put out in the coming months. I do see two hands now popping up. Dennis, I think you were first.
Thank you. Real quickly, do we align what we're doing on the carbon side in terms of establishing price with also the VEDR, so that we're not creating a separate penalty/incentives?
If I could just respond to that this way, Dennis. We are not establishing a carbon price with this proceeding. This is just to establish a value of carbon as an aid in decision making. It's not imposing, any kind of regulatory price. Does that answer the question?
The reason I asked is that if I looked at New York City's local law 97, I'm getting a lot of people asking about that. And so whenever we talk about the value of carbon, we immediately equate it to a penalty. And I just think we want to clarify that. That's all. And I think you did a great job doing that, Jared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Ann, you have a question?
Yeah, my question is so with the second one, the value of carbon, the end product is a guidance document and not a regulation. That's one. And I wanted to mention too that the renewable energy industry, a group of trade organizations, have weighed in on in VBER on setting the E-value and the discount rate. I know that this is different, but I think that our input there would be relevant here. So I just wanted to suggest that maybe you could take a look at that.
Certainly, we'd be happy. Go ahead, Ann.
It was a document that was filed in the VBER proceeding at the Public Service Commission.
Okay. Could you just forward that to me, Ann, and I will get it to the team that is working on this proceeding. And to your first question, yes, this would be a guidance document, not a formal regulation. But we still go through the public comment process in developing it.
Okay, thanks. And yes, I'll forward that.
Thank you.
Peter?
If this is already planned, this would be great to also ensure that the council gets an invite to that conference, and that an invite go out to all the people who are registered to be on our climate list. We had 400 some odd participants, so a lot of people viewing our proceedings, and they might want to be able to be part of that stakeholder conference now that we've put the date out there.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. I'm not sure when you're referring to the participants, you're talking about the participants on today's proceeding, or
I'm sorry, maybe I mixed the words. So it'd be great if this the announcement of your stakeholder conference went out to the full Climate Action Council, and for those who have signed up to get updates via the climate website. So there are attendees, I think, during or participants in this whole conference today.
You can do that. That shouldn't be a problem.
Yep.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Peter. Are there any other questions And you don't have, do you have a follow-up, or is that an old hand?
Oh, that's an old hand, sorry.
All right. You can see that Jared's been hard at work the last few months, and this whole team. Reflective of what I said in the beginning, that we haven't really kept our eye off the ball on this climate issue. So I guess if there are any other closing comments or questions, we can entertain those before we go on to the last order of business, which is next steps. I'll just wait a second to see if any hands pop up. Okay, I don't see. Donna.
Thanks, Basil. Just a quick follow-up. I think we started with this too. I would just like to renew the interest in the ability to possibly sit in or to consider whether Climate Action Council members can sit in on advisory panel meetings at some point, just simply not to be a participant, but to learn more about some of the issues before they come back to the council looking for votes, for example. So just a comment to consider. Thank you.
Okay, Donna, that's a good question. I philosophically have no opposition to that, but we have to impanel these groups and ultimately get them moving along and make their work as transparent as possible. So, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so next steps. Next slide. Really, a few next steps in my mind. First, selecting the next meeting date. I won't go through potential dates on this call /WebEx, but we will follow up with everybody shortly. Again, as to what I said back in March, we wanted to front load the work of the CAC and then impanel the various panels so that they could begin their work, and we would then meet at a less frequent basis. I think we'd like to get something done soon on this to really focus on the panel members and do voting on that front. The other issue is this interim meeting regarding the Just Transition Work Group. So I think really we will be following up with all of you on both those points, the next full meeting as well as the next, I would say, this interim meeting on Just Transition. So please watch your inboxes and or your cell phones for incoming from our team on that. I don't have anything else on my list. Jared, am I missing anything, or Alicia, on next big steps or hanging items out there? No. Okay.
No, I don't think there was anything else in terms of other housekeeping.
Okay. Well, I'll say it again, Alicia. Thank you. Thank you for everything you've done for the state, certainly for the Climate Action Council. But we'll all miss you. You've been fantastic, and keep in touch. Keep us posted on what you're doing with your life in sunny Massachusetts.
I will, but I've been very clear. I will be watching and cheering all of New York's climate progress going forward. I know sky's the limit, and New York will absolutely be the state setting the pace for everybody else to watch and follow. The governor's leadership it's just unmatched on this issue. So, he will continue to push to ever greater heights, supported by an outstanding cabinet and supported by this outstanding Climate Action Council. So really excited to watch and cheer some of the important work ahead.
Alicia, it's Jim Alashes. Take it from me. You could be in Boston, but you don't leave the family.
You seem like you might know what you're talking about on that.
See you next time. We'll leave it at that.
and this is Gil. Jim has another 60-slide PowerPoint deck to present.
All right.
Thanks everybody for sticking with the long meeting. We covered a lot of important ground. I appreciate it.
We did. Well, that'll be the last word. Thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your week and weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.